at times, three different individuals wanted me to play guitar in a way that sounded like how they played guitar on their demo, which is just kind of a ridiculous thing to ask. And I would say disrespectful to the recognition of the successful collaborative collective we had been for over a decade.
Hey, teachers, lift it salon.
Why are you at a public library? Did you need to use the bathroom?
So, folks, that is none other than Kim Thayil, who is, of course, known to the world as the lead guitarist in the band Soundgarden from their inception in 1984 up to their breakup in 1997, and again from their reunion in 2010 up to the suicide of frontman guitarist Chris Cornell in 2017. Thayil has a new memoir out named A Screaming Life, and I interviewed him for two consecutive nights, 2 weeks after the book was released. You'll hear both of those I'm about to share. I'm very excited to share the entire interview as one stretch. So about 2 hours and 15 minutes worth, where we discuss the book, among other things. Now, Thayil, although he needs very little introduction, was instrumental in helping Soundgarden establish themselves as one of the most visible, one of the most prominent, popular, the preeminent bands to emerge from Seattle in the late 80s and early 90s, alongside, of course, bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Mudhoney, The Screaming Trees, Alice in Chains, etc., etc. He is seen as one of the architects of what came to be known as grunge, and the sort of collective mindset of the bands coming out of the Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle and the surrounding area around that time. Now, the real progenitors of that sound, a slow, detuned, sludgy amalgamation that drew equally from metal, but wasn't quite metal, and drew from punk and hardcore, but wasn't quite punk and hardcore. The true origins of that are with a band called the Melvins, and that's by Thayil's own admission. But Soundgarden certainly, without question, put their own stamp on that sound. They had a very unorthodox approach to rhythm and a very quirky strangeness overall, harmonically and rhythmically. A lot is made of their odd time signatures, which they were using from the very, very beginning, which you can read about in Thayil's book. But there was more to what made them distinct than that. They had this very peculiar knack for making the meter of their songs feel kind of slightly off kilter, but also cyclical, so that odd time signatures sounded even. And even when they played in 4/4 and 3/4, it sounded a little bit, again, off kilter. Their approach to harmonically and melodically was also distinctive and odd. And even as they started to get more and more and more commercially appealing, there was this underlying, again, strangeness, for lack of a better word. And Thayil's approach, his very unconventional, unique, quirky, angular approach to the guitar, was a huge part in what established them and made their sound what it was. Now, he was born in Seattle. However, he grew up in a mixed race, mixed income suburb of Chicago named Park Forest, which he expounds on a lot in the book. It plays a pretty central role, that setting. And that is actually where he met future Seattle figures like eventual Soundgarden bassist Hiro Yamamoto and future Sub Pop co-founder Bruce Pavitt. It was actually Thayil who urged Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman. He gave them each the other's phone number and said, "You guys need to connect," and the rest is history. They co-founded the legendary label Sub Pop together, and Sub Pop is still around, and away we go. So if you're a fan of those bands that I mentioned, 90s alternative, 90s commercial rock, and just rock in general, Thayil, his shadow looms large over all of that. But it's important to note that Soundgarden, like when I first discovered them on the album Louder Than Love in 1989, they were played on a metal show. They were being marketed to metalheads. My immediate first impression on hearing that album, like right off the bat, from the opening drum salvo that kicks that record off, is that they were blending elements of Black Sabbath with Led Zeppelin. That was like the obvious thing that they wore on their sleeve. And even the promotional campaign for that record, I think, mentioned that. However, as the book lays out, their roots were more in the post-punk underground. So groups like Bauhaus, Killing Joke, Husker Du, the Meat Puppets, Black Flag, bands like that. And then they were also drawing very heavily from a shared love of the Beatles. And that all rolled together, again, into a sound that wasn't quite metal, but it was like metal adjacent, very appealing to metalheads, but with this sensibility that was more arty, even where you might not see it on the surface. And again, Thayil is a huge part of what gave their sound that character. They were not like conventional metal or even conventional grunge by any means. So I'm going to let him take it away. I would ask that you hit all the buttons and also make a donation. You know what? I was supposed to put a donation link in the show description. I think I did. You can donate via Venmo, Cash App, or buy me a coffee. I love sharing these long form interviews with you. They do take a lot of energy. So, for the price of a cup of coffee or something, you want to kick me a donation, every dollar counts, goes a long way. But without further ado, here is Kim Thayil. I will share my thoughts on the interview at the end. So I'll start with this. One of the more charming things about the whole story, your whole story, the story of the band, the story that's in the book, is that you were not Hero's first choice of the guitar player they wanted when he started playing with Chris. And then you really didn't want to do it. You kept trying to avoid it until finally he wore you down and you gave in.
Yeah. It wouldn't have been Soundgarden otherwise. I think we're a guitar band, so without a guitarist, its essential character and personality might not have occurred. We did a similar thing when making the choice about Chris as a singer. To be full-time singer. I don't know if you read that part in the book.
I did.
But that's also funny. It's like, well, maybe we'll keep him as a drummer and find someone else.
Yes, and I had read that ages ago. I had read that a quote from Chris actually saying that we were either looking for a drummer or a singer. But the reason that stood out to me, that stood out for two reasons. One, it was interesting to me that Hero didn't reach out to you first, considering you knew each other and you had made the trip to Seattle together, and he ostensibly would have known your taste and had admiration for you. I would have thought you guys would have had.
He knew I was really busy. I think I had just started a relationship. I was going to college. I was at the University of Washington. I worked full time, on weekends and nights, and I was going to school full time. And I was occasionally DJing at the University of Washington radio station, KCMU. I was really had a full schedule, very busy, and Hero was aware of that I was both working and going to school. So that was probably one of the things that played into his mind. Chris and I had been in a band together prior to that covers band,
the Shemps.
Yeah, there are photos of Hero and Chris. Hero is the original bass player of that. He's gone on the record on some video interviews with some facts that are demonstrably, untrue or inaccurate. He's not being malicious. It's just his memory. There's all kinds of evidence that indicates that he was in the band with this person, and the person was Chris, and Chris is the singer, and the drummer of the band, who was a roommate of mine, and the guy Matt, who had formed the band, is also in the pictures. And this all was before I was a member of the band, but they never performed together. They rehearsed together and they did some photo sessions, and then Hero quit. The drummer and the singer were both my roommates. Chris was not living with Hero at the time. They had a bunch of gigs lined up. Hero quit, and so they called me, and they said, "Hey, can you fill in and play some bass?" And I did it to help out my two roommates and friends, the drummer and the guitarist. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And you lay that out in the book. I've read the book and listened to it. So the other thing that stood out to me about that is you were at the University of Washington taking classes, but the sense I got from the book is that you still didn't really have a clear sense of your life direction at that point. You were taking classes, you had a job, but there was this sense of I don't know, maybe underlying malaise or something. And I'm curious.
I think like many students, it takes a while to decide on what you're going to major on. And even if you choose a major, you're at a liberal arts college and not a vocational school. So the objective isn't always, career oriented. Some people may find it that way. I find the people who take university experience as a vocational school and orient their career, by their studies, these people tend to major in business or perhaps engineering. These things they're very marketable skills. As a matter of fact, people who are business majors often tend to have little academic interest. So that's not unusual, to be in a liberal arts college and not to have a career trajectory or a vocational aspiration. But that wasn't the issue. I think the issue there is simply that Hero was aware that regardless of my direction, that my days and weeks were very filled up and I wasn't available. And the only reason why I made myself available was as a favor to a friend. And the reason why I continued to make myself available was because of how rewarding those initial get-togethers were.
Sure. You talk about that as being instant chemistry, but I wanted to get just a snapshot of you before we talk about the band. What would you have done? Like, what would your life have turned out like if you hadn't ultimately said yes to Hero's repeated, beyond an invitation, sort of badgering you to go?
It's hard to tell.
What do you think? I mean,
I was semester. I got my BA I would have my vision next. Do I want to get a resume together and start marketing a philosophy degree, which I didn't have particular interest. As I said, I wasn't vocationally motivated. As many colleges and becoming in years of your commitment in school, if you go straight through, you're a 21-year-old. Unless you're in Europe and you have some kind of scholastic and vocational tracking as they do there. It's not unusual for a 21-year-old to not be sure what they want to be when they grow up. And there are many people who go to school
Sure.
for 4 years and they get recruited for baseball or basketball or football or something. So you never know what skills or interests will develop. And that's part of the reason why people, I think, attend college, is to explore the various different subjects and learn more about themselves and their interests and develop those interests and skills. So I don't know. I mean, I might have gone to graduate school. I don't know because I was young, and most people often don't know, with the exception of people who are very targeted toward medical school, or if they're getting a degree in English or business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, not English or business. Sorry, engineering or business.
Engineering, right?
My dad's an engineer and a business major. My mom is an English
teacher, and who also taught music.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's starkly clear in the book is, number one, your dad, well into Soundgarden's career, or maybe I was a little unclear on that, but like at least at the beginning, when it was just kind of like an uncertain sort of, your parents said, "Oh, Kim has got a job in music," right? That your dad is like, "All right, you got to just what's your plan A?"
I'm not sure they ever thought that was my job. I'm not clear that they ever at that time accepted it as a career choice. I'm not sure that I saw it as a career choice. I'm not sure that Chris or Hero saw it as a career choice. It was an occupation. It's what we did with our time. But I don't know. Beyond that, we weren't fast-tracked with management or record company interests as perhaps a more career-oriented talent, might have been, to have that kind of ambition and drive. That's not the case with many rock bands, if not most. I think part of it is amateurish, and part of it is for the love of playing music. Music in itself is its own reward, when you're sharing it with other individuals. So having to have a career ambition with that regard, is not necessary to do what we do. And there are dozens and dozens of bands, and many of them never made records. Many of them never went on tour. That's not unusual. And that's fairly common too. I think there are people whose interests or talents are developed and nurtured, and they're kind of tracked again for a vocational career with singing and dancing and acting. That's what you might see with the Mickey Mouse Club. Many of the popular pop culture talents that we're aware of came right out of the Mickey Mouse Club, and these people usually are trained in acting, dancing, and singing, and they go on to have success in one, if not all, of the above. I could immediately name people like Christina Aguilera, Justin Timberlake, Britney Spears. These are all Mouseketeers, the Mickey Mouse Club. They all sing, dance, and act. But there are other people. Gosh, I don't know. There's some people who succeed in acting, like Ryan Gosling. I think he was a Mouseketeer or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know, but there's plenty of people who've gone through that sort of production line, the Disney production line. But
performance academies, performance schools. We certainly aren't doing that. I mean, I'm at a liberal arts school here. Neither Hero, Chris didn't finish high school. Hero wasn't in college yet. But yeah, these Mouseketeers and Mickey Mouse Club, they're kind of, I mean, they're very talented people, but in a way you can kind of, see an analogy to be like a trained monkey. I mean, from a very young age, they're developing these skills, often at the push or encouragement or from their parents, and then their teachers, and eventually managers and record company people. It's sort of like a farm system, like you might have in baseball or football,
hockey, or
noticing someone's height and their foot size when they're like 12 or 13, and thinking, hey, this guy has this kind of a whatever, arm length or foot size that they can try to anticipate how the person's going to grow and say, let's watch this guy and see how his basketball skills develop,
Well, and so what I was getting at though was your dad clearly wanted you to get a real job, which you say, be an engineer or get a higher degree, go for a master's in philosophy, or a PhD.
No, he didn't like me majoring in philosophy. Yeah, he didn't like me majoring in philosophy. He wouldn't have encouraged me to get a master's in philosophy, since that there's no jobs in that unless I wanted to be a teacher. But those decisions weren't his to make. I didn't, I understand there are traditional Asian families and immigrant families that might have, where the parents might have more influence or say over the direction of their kids' academic and professional pursuits, especially if they claim that they're investing in it by paying for their education or whatever. That wasn't the case here. My parents in general advocated on behalf of academia, just learning everything, learning whatever you can. And that love of learning and the curiosity was instilled in me primarily by my mom, and by my father as well. The whole vocational sort of focus kind of came as a young adult. That wasn't part of my rearing as a kid. When I was a young adult, and all of a sudden, it didn't come from my mom, it just came from my dad. I think my dad probably thought that's what a dad does. I think he felt it was his responsibility to get me to start earning money. That's really important to my dad.
Well, and
it wasn't to me.
What's funny is that if you had gotten a philosophy master's, you might have ended up busking with a guitar on the street anyway for loose change.
Yeah.
So it might have been the slow track to rock and roll anyway.
Or maybe be a comedian like Steve Martin.
Right. So, but the one thing I was getting at is your mom invested a lot in the futures of her students, and you didn't have that connection with her. You write about this in the book.
Yeah, well, I think she was interested in her student success, both as I think I think there was a maternal sense from her, and as a teacher, but perhaps also as a friend. I think she wanted her students to succeed and go on to great things. I think it's probably the case with most teachers, but I think that was her focus. You had, especially at a junior high level, every hour you have a new class of 24 students coming in, 24 to 30 or whatever. So in a quarter or semester, my mom could have six classes of 24. She'd have like 140 students. In any, for any period of a half a year, and some repeats for the second half of the year. So that requires a lot of attention and time. And for whatever reason, her that focus wasn't really there with me or my sister for some reason. Maybe because the work took a lot of time.
Yeah. So in the book, you write about it as if you and your mom didn't relate, which I think is interesting because you were musical and she taught music, which, I mean, I guess that's not that.
I didn't read music. She read music. She could sight read. She never taught me that. I may have just picked it up simply. My mom likes to suggest it's something I inherited, but it's much more likely that music was part of the family culture, in that my parents both sang. They had met in choir in church, and my mom, we didn't have a piano when I was younger because pianos are expensive, and they were young and they were students, so they're moving around a lot. Pianos are also heavy, so my father had discouraged investing in something that you have to haul around from one apartment to another. So anyways, for whatever reason, that just didn't happen. I don't know if it's entirely neglect. I just think my parents were busy. They were young, they were students, they were working, and then when my mom got more involved in her career, that's exactly where her focus went.
So, just one last question on this but at a certain point that changes though, because you write about how your parents both, even after they split up, would contact you a lot for like autographed merch, and it seems like their attitude changed once you, at least to that degree, and they were like asking you to make sure you stayed in contact with like distant relatives and cousins and uncles and things like that. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, you write about that in the book, but I guess I'm curious.
I think for my parents, their social station might have they might have felt that it had risen with their friends, colleagues, and families, and partly through their relationship with their son, or I might have, what I ended up saying to my folks, but primarily my dad, was to not act as my agent. That I have management agents who behave in that way, and they do not have to solicit, my participation in providing merchandise or records, and to remind them that I'm not a store and I'm not a distributor. So
you didn't have the stuff on you anyway.
Exactly,
at your house.
and I'm not directly selling it. And my dad is a MBA as well as an engineer. He understands how these things work, but still, he put the pressure on me to provide these things. I just can't do it, Dad. You can. There was no internet. They could have gone to a website and ordered the things for themselves, or he could have ordered them to behalf. But so I have to explain that we have a merchandising company that we have a contract with, and they manufacture, distribute these things in stores and sometimes at concerts. So I myself would have to purchase these and then send them to you or whatever. So it made things a little bit difficult, but even though he understood business, maybe he didn't understand ours entirely, or my obligation. But your parents might also are inclined to guilt their children, and I think, from what I understand, Indian parents are not too bad at guilting their kids if they need to. But I was a little bit resistant because I had enough pressure as it was, just from the work, but also gaining some more fame or recognizability or notoriety. So my parents' interests kind of coincided with our success. If it had been there at the beginning, that would have been a different thing. But it grew as public profile and success grew. So in other words, they're almost like a mole to the outside, whereas the outside world, you could distance yourself from that kind of access, but it's more difficult to do that if it's your parents. So in a way, they were sort of like, they benefited from having that access by being close to me, and I love my parents and love them, and so in a way, they're kind of taking advantage of that. They're not really aware of the outside pressures. This isn't just coming from my parents; it's also going to come from friends and other family members and just the general public. So as you're trying to negotiate relationships as they develop with colleagues, peers, strangers, and then professional associates, you have this added burden of redefining and re-understanding your relationship with your parents. So it is kind of weird. Yeah, parents get divorced and they go off into their own lives, and then they have this property, which will be called their child, and it starts paying off, and they think, well, I invested in this, so they want their return, and you have to explain to them, it's like, this is not the kind of relationship we had. If we developed any, it certainly wasn't this, but this is what you want. Well, you could ask me, is that what I want? Or is that the kind of relationship I want to have with my parents, or perhaps might have benefited from? They didn't consider that. My parents are pretty good at being, for the most part, into themselves. Which happens, I think, when folks get divorced. They kind of focus on themselves a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that does make sense. So this is also really age appropriate. But you and Hero drive out to the Pacific Northwest, and you're thinking, oh, we'll go to Evergreen State in Olympia. Oh wait, we didn't apply. Like we didn't even apply to go here.
Yeah. Also, it was there's just more opportunities in Seattle for employment opportunities and education opportunities. There are more universities in Seattle than there are in Olympia. I think I'll let you finish your thought there.
Well, no, I just thought it was, again, that's a very 20-something thing to do. You guys were like hell-bent on getting out of
Dodge. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Even though you speak very highly, very, very highly of Park Forest, you're proud of it, but you needed something new. But it just, because initially after reading the book the first time, I read it a couple months ago, they sent it to me early, and I was like, oh yeah, well, his parents got degrees there, so of course it makes sense to go to Seattle. But that didn't seem like that was really in the calculation when I
it was part of it. Evergreen State College was very much like the high school program that Hero and I and a number of other friends, including the Pabbits, Bruce, who started Sub Pop, all of us elected to be in this program. It was, it was experimental. It was successful for a number of years. And Evergreen State College was an alternative college, very similar to the high school programs that we were involved in. So it made sense that we continued our, higher education with a similar, sort of
pedagogical model. You mean like a similar, like a curriculum type? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But Olympia is a smaller metropolitan area and other opportunities. We still have to pay rent, and it was just more difficult. It was a little bit more of a smaller, depressed sort of town. And frankly, it was a little bit more homogenous. There were, at the time, it seemed to be two kinds of people. There were the Greeners, which was the name for the Evergreen State students, the Greeners. And then there were the Townies. And Townie culture and Greener culture were both slightly different. A lot of the Townies might have had a pickup truck. I might have been a little bit more small town oriented, maybe a little bit more conservative. The Greeners tend to be a little bit more politically liberal. Often they came from trust fund, wealthier families, So maybe from the East Coast, some trust fund kids are going to a little hippie school. And I don't know how Hero felt, but I personally thought both were a little bit annoying. both these little like side cultures. I mean, there are individuals within that. There are people like Bruce Pavitt. There are people like Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons. There are a lot of interesting individuals and a lot of talented people. But in general, the culture of the town seemed to be polarized, and neither of the poles are particularly appealing. And it's hard to get work there. So Seattle was where we ended up landing. And so, yeah, it wasn't simply because my parents went to school here. There are a number of factors. There were some friends who moved out here. There was the Evergreen State College, which had its attraction. And there was also a cool music scene. There were a number of bands that we had heard growing up in Chicago, as in our late teens, early 20s, that had come from Seattle that we liked. Bands like the Beakers and the Blackouts and Student Nurse. So there was definitely some interest in that. It's in the music scene. Also, it was small. It seemed a little bit more accessible, easier to navigate than Chicago, which was huge and dense and very union oriented, So in a way, kind of closed. It's like you had to join a club and be of a certain age and pay your dues. And it's like, just want to get together with some friends and play music. and have our friends come and check it out, then have their friends come and check it out, and they can buy us the beer after that.
Okay. I just thought it was funny that you guys thought you could get into Evergreen State and didn't apply.
Because we could have gotten in. I don't think that would have been a problem. We didn't apply because the goal was, just let's go there, and when we save up enough money, we establish. That's another thing. It would take a year to establish a residency, in which case tuition would come down significantly. So the goal really was just to leave home. We were that age. We were 21, Actually, Hero was 20.
Okay, so it was just to kind of get a smooth landing, get your legs, your foundation set, and then make a move, like figure out what you were going to do after that.
Perhaps. I mean, either way, we could stay in the Chicago suburbs and work in some mall, or we could just go 2,000 miles away and get a job there with some some scholastic ambitions, or play music. We moved out there. We brought my guitars with me, and Hero brought his mandolins. So that was entirely all the things you might want to do. Play music, go to school. If you want to, just hang out, be on your own.
Okay, so getting to the Soundgarden part of it, where you have this instant chemistry at that first time you show up in what was then Heroes and Chris's The Attic, where Hero and Chris were roommates, and you reluctantly go. You have this instant chemistry. Material starts like generating instantly. You have many songs from these first few rehearsals that are just. I had initially thought that the odd meter element of Soundgarden mostly had come from Chris, because he was the drummer at the time, but it makes it sound like this is just something that generated between the three of you.
Yeah, or individuals. I mean, most of the songs are none of the songs are written on drums. They're all written on guitar and or bass. And if Hero came up with a bass riff, then I would build guitar parts around it. And if I wrote the guitar riffs, yeah. So that musical idea would determine the time signature. Chris can't just call out a time signature and have us try to fit a piece of melody and harmony and chords within that. We could have done that, but that would have been unnatural. That would be like some 70s prog band. We were natural. There was no ambition or goal to write something in odd time signatures. We just simply did so. It was part of.
You guys didn't even know a lot of the time at first, is what
That's correct. It was entirely part of our personalities and styles to do something like that. It was not an objective. And if you try to make it objective, it's just going to sound stupid and corny and forced. Most of our songs were in common time. They were in 4/4, or fours or threes or sixes or eights. They're in more common time signatures, because it was rock. But I happen to write things that were in fives or alternate, and everyone else would pick up on it.
So you're saying that came mainly from you? I mean,
I never said it came mainly from
reiterate.
me. I'd say I never said it came mainly from
you and Hero.
Yeah, but if I wrote a riff and it was that way, then it would be that. It would be that way. There's nothing concocted about this. This is all just playing an instrument, and we have unique personalities and unique musical abilities. So these things just happen. No one's trying to do something in a weird time signature. I mean, I imagine classical composers do that. Maybe some jazz dudes do that, but not us.
No, what I had read that you guys said for years and years and years was you never knew that first, and then people would say, "Oh, that's odd." And you go, "Oh, yeah, it is," kind of a thing.
Well, if it felt odd, we would count it out. Either Hero or I or Chris would do it as a drummer, or somebody else would, like one of our friends might point it out. I think most of the early stuff that was in 5s or 3s or 7s probably did come from me, because that's kind of how, because guitarist and guitar riffs and the riffs would come out like that. Jack Endino, who was a guitarist and a drummer, as well as an engineer and producer, he had that ability, especially as a drummer. So there were a number of times I'd jam with him. And in one case, I wrote a song, and it was pretty fun. I wrote a song with Jack Endino way back in the early days. I wrote the guitar parts, and Jack wrote some lyrics and played drums on it. And the guitar part I wrote, because Jack was a drummer, he immediately said, "That's in 10/4." I had no idea. It was just, again, it was just Jack and I in his basement recording and playing. It was just his skill as a drummer and producer had him pick up on that and brought it to my attention immediately. So it's just something that I mean, it's an identifying factor of Soundgarden's music, but I don't think there's anything. It's hard to say there's anything special about it, since it's not concocted, or premeditated.
Well, I will say, I would counter, what's special about it is that the band always had a knack for making that sound natural, to the point that somebody could, like the second part, whatever you'd call that second section of Rusty Cage, where it like totally changes into that riff. You wouldn't know that that's in 7 unless you counted it. It
Isn't it in 7?
I think so. I've tried to. Oh,
the ending part. That's the third part. Yeah, that might be 7. That might alternate between a couple different things. But yeah.
But you wouldn't know that, because you can move your body.
That's why it sounds natural. You don't notice it until. The only way you can really notice it is if you try to dance to it, or you kind of play it. So that's the thing. We didn't write something that was odd and then try to make it sound natural. We wrote something that was natural, and then you realize that it's odd later.
Well, and so that's what I'm getting at. So what you describe at that, for instant chemistry, this is the term you used. You also say that all of 3 of you, Hero, and Chris, felt that this pairing, this musical configuration, drew something out of you that you hadn't experienced or expressed before musically. So it sounds like there's something like ineffable.
I think everyone stylistically, they're stylistically, the opportunities expanded for each of us individually. Playing with the other 2 people, there was more I could do with Chris on drums and Hero on bass. There was more Hero could do as a bassist with me playing guitar. I had more versatility than the previous guitarists he had played with. There was just more I could do. And this drummer was a drummer who also sang, so he understood where he was in the song, and that was a strength, and it allowed him to be more versatile. And Chris was also learning how to play guitar, and he was writing songs. So because of that, we each benefited from the other 2's strengths, to expand our abilities and potentials as musicians and as songwriters. It's like, how they used to say about tennis, you're as good as the person who's on the other side of the net, or not. You're not as good as a person on the other side of the net. Your abilities can be brought out by how good your opponent is. If you're playing with a little kid, you're not going to be slamming too many aces intentionally. But as you get better people to play with, your ability to play will also increase until you hit that limit of your skills, and then you need more practice.
Well, I did not know they said that about tennis, and
or ping pong, or what. Yeah, I mean, if you play with someone better, you play, but you
sure.
play better. Yeah,
sure.
It's more of a challenge. You're challenging the other person's ability, and they're challenging your ability. So yeah,
So I want to fast forward, because I have questions about different points along this story, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the construction of the book itself, how you and Adam put this together, because you wrote the liner notes to the Chris Cornell box set that would have
Yes.
been several years ago, not quite a decade, but
I wrote liner notes for a number of Soundgarden releases and reissues. The liner notes in the I think I wrote some notes in the Bad Motorfinger anniversary box.
You did.
A lot of those are compiled, but like, Echo of Miles, Telephantasm, Live on I-5, those all have liner notes for me. Alter Ego K's reissue on Sub Pop. I wrote liner notes for a Devo reissue for the album Oh No, It's Devo on Infinite Zero Records. I wrote liner notes for the reissue of the Beakers complete set on K Records. I wrote liner notes for the reissue for the 40th anniversary of Rush Moving Pictures when they reissued.
I did not read those. I have not seen those.
Yeah, they reissued Moving Pictures. I believe it's the 40th anniversay, and I did the liner notes for that.
You mean they didn't let Mark Arm do it from when he sent you a postcard that said, "Fuck, you guys sound like Rush now"?
Yeah, they did. He didn't ask Mark. They're on the same label as we are, so the product manager asked me. I've done a few liners where I've written things for little coffee table books for like the Butthole Surfers and for Hugh Syme, the Rush's artist.
The Rush artist.
So there's a number of things I've written, but this is more challenging. It's a much larger piece. It isn't simply an essay, or it's a number of different thoughts. So the way that works was a series of interviews with Adam and I would conduct, where I'm giving the anecdotes, I'm giving weight and tone to the anecdotes, why this was important. And Adam would interview me from his experience as a journalist to explore various ideas. But then I'd give my caveats saying, well, it means this, like I am when I'm talking to you now. It's like, well, it means this, or this is the condition. And I tend to meander and digress. So he would transcribe this information, run it by me, write out some roughs, and I'd make sure, I probably read at least 5 or maybe 6 different revisions to, both identify errors, either factual errors or mistranscriptions, or to change the tone. And he organized them he did 2 amazing things. One is he caught my tone from other things that I've written, from our conversations and my personality. And then he took those digressions and meanders, the brackets inside the parentheses, inside quote marks. He would give it a narrative body that was a little bit more coherent. I don't want to say linear, but organized, because what was brilliant was that he saw that there was something kind of lateral about the way I spoke and organized things and the way I think. So he would not make it chronologically linear. He would have the anecdotes give weight or body to other anecdotes and put them within a context in a way that provided humor and meaning towards later events in the book. And that's often how I might speak. I might give the setup and present various ideas and say, this is what this all meant here. He did that and was so efficient and coherent. It was really impressive. But still, when I read it, it sounded like my voice. I could hear myself. If there's a passage or a page, I'd say that I wouldn't use a word like that. I wouldn't use a phrase like that. That doesn't feel like me. It feels like it's someone else talking. I would point that out. But he was so consistently good at it. Is probably from listening to hours and hours of our conversations and the anecdotes provided, but also he was, as a journalist, he has really great research skills. So he would speak to other people. He'd call up other people and get some background or confirmation to verify certain events or facts. But he also read these things that I've written, all the liner notes I've written. Plus, I've written, probably a large body of our social media posts, it's mostly the ones that deal with our catalog and our history. A lot of the Instagram, Facebook things, those have been written by me over the past number of years. So he's read probably all of those. So he gets an idea of my tone and my humor and the way I kind of, not just the way I phrase things, but just the kind of pacing. And that's present in his narrative. But what's better is his pacing makes it engaging in a way that doesn't require that you follow this labyrinthine narrative that I might, give out orally. And I suppose if I had to write, like when I have to write something, it's really draining because it requires that my brain organize itself in a way that's different than when I engage, verbally, in an oral sense. So, for me, it takes a lot of energy to organize that thing, but it is different than it has some of the components of the way I might play guitar or talk, but I have to be able to read it and have it, So, yeah, that's probably why it's different, because I have to both write it and read it. But he did a great job at that.
Well, yeah. So your train of thought in thinking and speaking is more discursive, I guess is the word, or you're more.
I suppose that might be a series of digressions and meanders. I might, it's not very linear. It's kind of like this idea that I want to convey involves, establishing these other facts and anecdotes or whatever, and then time together. So. Yeah,
but he did actually carve out a train of thought that, as you say, is coherent. But he would also set things up for like dramatic payoff. I
think so. Well, yeah, I think it's kind of like telling a joke, which is in a way that I might speak orally. I might know the weight of a particular event or anecdote, so then I could tell it to people given the backstory, which makes the impact of the event, it gives it a greater weight or irony or whatever. And he certainly read that in me or saw that, and it was pretty dang good. I mean, the fact that I can read it and see in it me, my voice, see it paralleling other things that I've written is it's an achievement that I regard, from his. In other words, he was writing, he was organizing these ideas in my voice and not in his.
Sure. No.
I thought it was pretty amazing that he did a good job of it.
Yeah, like I'll give you a perfect example of that, where anybody who's listened to one of your interviews over the years or seen one or heard one, where the line where you say, but the songs that Matt and Chris and Ben were writing for Down on the Upside, they didn't write them on piano or tuba or whatever the other instrument was. They wrote them on guitar. That read off the page, because I didn't listen to the book first. I read it first. You have to make a choice with a book and an audiobook. It's like a movie of a book. You ruin whichever one you do second is going to be ruined by the first one you did. So I read the book first. Well, the audiobook wasn't available, but that's what I would have chosen. Then I listened to it. It's a tough choice to make, but like reading that off the page, I was like, that sounds like what I think this person speaks like.
Yeah.
What I think Kim Thayil speaks like. So really you got to do.
And my friends are saying that too. I mean, my friends and family who read the books, they're recognizing me in it. But part of that is because Adam got to work with transcriptions where he asked me a question, then I give my long roundabout that meander of explanation, or I'll relate specific anecdotes, and then he transcribes it, writes those anecdotes, and connects them into the context, And what I like about it is that he didn't make it chronically linear. I mean, he did, not as severely as I may orate, but in a way that made it interesting. How he it was more so in the earlier days, but I think the editors in the earlier versions, I think there was a little bit more,
back and forth jumping,
time jumping,
non-chronological.
Billy Pilgrim and Slaughterhouse-Five becoming unstuck in time, and I think there's more of that. I think the editor, kind of wanted a little bit to make it a little bit. I liked it even more so when in the style where Adam would kind of like take something from one period of time and have it set up something from earlier, or vice versa.
It's very effective the way it builds to a couple of different crescendos, actually, but it isn't completely linear. And he was like a musical arranger, basically the literary equivalent of like an arranger to your everything, the raw.
Oh, yeah. Here's the melody, here's the rhythm, here's the time signature, and then he kind of like, puts it together, like how long do we want to make the verse, and should the chord come in first? Will we have a bridge here? Yeah, things like that. Yeah.
Dad, of all the, but okay, so a couple other things I want to ask you about that are really important sort of inflection points in the Soundgarden story. I don't want to spoil it too much for anybody, because I started the book wondering how much you were going to divulge. It seemed like the tone was sort of diplomatic at first, and then it starts to slowly expand, I think, and you start to share more. Multiple members of Soundgarden over time grappled with, I guess, the scale of the success, and this isn't only specific to Soundgarden. It seemed like it was something that was shared by several of the Seattle bands, like openly feeling disillusioned with that scale of success. And it starts with Hero at first, and then eventually sort of starts to seep into everyone. The Ben, you, Chris, all seem to have that. You say that success is not what you had envisioned it, and I'll run this by you.
And I'm not sure if I had a vision of what success would be. Just like what I said earlier about being in college, I'm not sure if I had, a conclusion drawn for the trajectory of my studies.
Okay, right. Because you say, because in the book, actually, now I recall, you say, if you have ever thought, you say in second person to the reader or to the audience, if it's likely not going to be what you imagine it to be if you are thinking of pursuing a career in music. So that's you just reminded me of that. I saw Soundgarden 4 times in the 90s, and I'm curious to get your impression of this. I thought it was interesting that up until 1992, it seemed like the band was very animated by this sense of like striving and moving forward. Then by the time you get to 1994, the band seems really dispirited a lot on stage. It seems to be a totally different vibe and mood. And I'm wondering, that kind of does align with what you're describing in the book, but I'm wondering, because I always wondered, like, would the band be like, no, that's bullshit?
Well, as I mentioned in the book, by that time there were a number of relationships that had been damaged or ended. There were friends who we had lost, in unexpected, ways. All those things made the general celebratory nature of Seattle's initial rise and prominence. It made it less festive, much less. It gave it a very real and darker sheen to what we were, more of a matte finish and less glossy.
Yeah, and there were other things converging as you and Adam show. There's things in your individual personal life, significant other breakup, after many years. There's the Kurt Cobain thing as you're referencing, but then also, having you even describe it, you're like
Andy Wood, losing Andy was a big one. There were a number of other people. We were very aware of our friends in Alice in Chains and the fact that they stopped playing and that they were having various issues and struggles. So we were learning quite a bit of how, friends and colleagues were either failing to negotiate the turns and twists, or some of the struggles they may have been encountering. And it wasn't as celebratory or festive as it may have been in the early days,
Right. And I want to ask you about this. There's a number of different chapters in the book, scenes and anecdotes, and there's like 20 that I could ask you about right now. But I want to focus on 1995 to 97, because the one thing that distinguishes Down on the Upside is that the context changed overnight from the audience's perspective. I cannot tell you how many essays or reviews music journalists have said, that album is sort of you can hear that it's the epitaph of the band and it's the epitaph of grunge.
Yeah.
That's not the tone that's not the way it came across when it was released at all.
No. I don't agree with that. I think one thing I've learned that I became aware of then was that journalists often make bad scientists, and pop culture journalists seem to be oblivious to things like just academic things, especially like science and stuff. Now, there are other journalists that maybe are a little bit more evidence-based. Certainly journalists who write about law or write about history or write about science. So in pop culture, the academic and intellectual requirements are definitely slacker. You often get peers involved with that, other musicians or other people involved in the music business in one way or another. And so I think what is happening here, and it's not unusual, I see it all the time, is that people say this album came out and they toured a bunch and then they broke up, and then they go back with that evidence and then they try to understand the cause, but they're getting the causality kind of reversed, rather than saying,
sure,
these are the set of behaviors and then these behaviors, cause this thing. And then we can see that perhaps this may be the effect or whatever, but they're looking at what is known and given, and that's the evidence. And they try to go back to try to figure out how it all came together. And they're going back and inferring causes that probably weren't connected.
They're reading into it in hindsight because
exactly.
And that's broke up.
Exactly, and that's just sloppy. But these are pop culture journalists, and I'm not pointing fingers at you or Adam, my co-author, is a journalist. He's really great at this. We talk about this stuff all the time, but it just happens. And there are other things there are worse things that happen with pop culture journalists. Is they have a thesis in their head. They have their belief, and they do an interview, or they're writing a review of a record with something in mind,
sure.
and they pick the evidence which supports their position.
Thesis. They have a thesis to start out with.
Yeah, and this is kind of the type of thing that Trump and much of his administration does. It's regardless of whether you're conservative or liberal. This is just knuckleheaded thinking. It's deeply stupid, and we've benefited from having a lot of people who reach a higher level in politics or law or whatever that have overcome these kind of inabilities to to reason that we have when we're younger, and that we have to remain vigilant on throughout our lives. But you get these people that totally give up, just totally throw it all away, just give up, and everything's on their feelings and their hunches and their guts. And that's where you get these crazy conspiracy theories that motivate policy that affects hundreds of millions of people. It is terrible. It is bad. It's sloppy, and it's fucking stupid. But there they are. We elected people like that. And now, granted, within that, there are people who are perfectly bright that can gatekeep against, the worst intentions of people pulling the slot machine handle. But it seems like it's a battle. It's more of a battle now than it perhaps has ever been. But they're politicians, and often they have a background in law, and very infrequently they have a background in math or science or whatever. So
sure, and they're playing off of people's feelings all the time. That's their job in a way.
But courtroom lawyers understand precedents, they understand evidence. You're right, but often, degrees understand that. And that's good, but often they lack. It'd be nice if they had a little bit better understanding of math, or learn how to play chess or science or something. So yeah, you do see that. You do see that when they're talking about Down the Upside. They'll say, here's what we know what happened. The band came apart, and therefore this must, you can hear it. It's like, no, you can't hear it. They're great songs, and they're great records, and everyone gave their best. The band wasn't falling apart there. I was dissatisfied with my representation, with some of the material. I was dissatisfied with my role in recording and performing some of this material, but I love the material. The material wouldn't have been there if I didn't like it. If I didn't like a song, I would have said, I don't want to do that, and it wouldn't have been on the record. I like the songs, and by liking it means that I want to play it. I want to play that song. I mean, it was a blast. Some songs took days, like Overfloater took me days to try to just capture the feel that was appropriate for that song. But a song like And Unkind, I whipped out my guitar part on that in like 15 minutes, which is just crazy. So I love the song. Boot Camp's a beautiful song, and Apple Bite, they're all great. So that there's no problem with the material. The problem was just the change in the nature of the way the individuals were writing and creating with each other. It wasn't really happening. The collaborative spirit was diminished, and it was a focus on individual authorship and creation, which became a little bit more pronounced. Well, individual authorship and creation requires less communication and sharing in a collaborative sense. Well, that's discouraging from the kind of band we'd always been. We now had these little pockets, that were here, play my song, you sing my song, come up with a cool drum beat for my song, play it faster or whatever, So you're not really behaving like a band. We're kind of behaving like a warehouse for solo records is what ended up happening. And since we're a guitar band and I'm the main guitarist, then a lot of that falls on my shoulder. And it's like, geez, I could play as the guitarist in Soundgarden would play, or you can kind of try to have me accommodate, these individual visions. So it's frustrating, but the point is that I loved all the songs there, and everyone did. That's why they're on the album. So it's a great album with great songs and great performances. It was after that there were certainly pressures, in making that record. I was certainly dissatisfied in the studio, but that's not to say the other guys were. But then we go and play live, and then other frictions develop, and I think people give emphasis to the dysfunction, deterioration more so than they should, because at that point our band had lasted 12 and a half years. My mother and father's marriage lasted 12 years. My band with my collaboration with these other people lasted longer than my parents' marriage, and I'm sure it lasted longer than many people's marriages, or I would often say to people then, what's the longest you've ever been at one place of employment? What's the longest job you've had? People would find like, oh, well, I was a dishwasher cook at this one place for 3 years, or I worked in this factory for nearly 4 or 5, you know. Well, at a young age, you're less likely to find people that have committed to one place of employment or relationship for such a duration. So I see Soundgarden as an incredible success that it went for 12 and a half years. And then again for another.
But you had said before that you and Matt did not think that was going to be the last Soundgarden album while you were making it. There wasn't a sense of that. Your issue was that all three of them were trying to shoehorn they were impelling you to shoehorn your guitar style
I think they wanted. Yeah, exactly.
Capture what was on their demos.
I think at times 3 different individuals wanted me to play guitar in a way that sounded like how they played guitar on their demo, which is just kind of a ridiculous thing to ask. And I would say disrespectful to the recognition of the successful collaborative collective we had been for over a decade. So I would never, it wouldn't fly if I were to ask, if I were to tell Matt, hey, lay off the ride cymbal a little bit, or Chris, can you?
Were they doing that? How much were they doing that? How much were they doing that with each other though, at the same time?
Well, we're a guitar band. These songs are all written on guitar. Matt's not bringing a tape in with his drums performance. He's bringing in a tape of a song he wrote guitar chords and riffs for, and so is Ben, and so is Chris.
Okay.
And I'm the guitarist.
So how many of those songs do not, like, my impression is that you still played on all the songs.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is also the case with Super Unknown, in spite of the BS that Michael Beinhorn has said. I think his memory is a little bit off there. Because we remixed Super Unknown. Remember, for his 20th anniversary, we mixed it in 5 points in Blu-ray. That's 5 point surround sound.
Yeah. 5.1. Yeah.
Blu-ray. So that was mixed here at Studio X Bad Animals. And we're attending to the mixes and reviewing them and listening to them and checking out the 5 point effect. And it is very clear at that point. It's like, I think Michael might have made some comment at some point about to that effect. And I go, Adam, what do we got here? What's yours? 2 of you and 2 of Chris. And then your guitar solos and color parts. Pretty much every song. The difference is there are a number of songs that Chris wrote where at the beginning it's just him and his guitar until the band comes in. Like I think Fourth of July is Chris's guitar and voice, and then the drums and bass and guitar come in. With Black Hole Sun, it's just guitar and voice, I believe, and then the little verse guitars come in, and then drums and bass, and then I come in on the what is next? The little verse part, and then the chorus part. The bridge part, the B section. There are a few songs like Super Unknown is my music. So it starts with my guitar, and it's playing. It's kind of the riff, and then the band comes in, drums and bass, and then Chris's guitar. There's a couple of my guitars there. I'm playing slightly different parts, and it's like that. So down the Day I Try to Live is the same way. It starts with Chris's guitar and vocal. And then the band comes in. And all that makes sense because Chris is also a drummer, and he was also our drummer. So if you're going to have a metronome, that metronome will be the guy who's singing and who wrote the song, and he's counting out, and he's singing along to his right hand, which is, if you watch, that's often how singers play guitar, from their elbow as opposed to their wrist. It's metronomic. You're orienting yourself both in pitch and in rhythm and in the song. So that all makes total sense. But the funny thing is, some of those songs had really long intros. 4th of July is a fairly long intro, and Black Hole Sun and Down and Dad Tried to Live also have relatively long intros.
So yeah, because Beinhorn had said that you don't.
Yeah, he's raw. He's full of shit. He's we listen to the mixes, and what he doesn't understand, there's color. Every song has color parts, which I came up with, and a few that Chris came up with, but mostly a lot of things that aren't on the original demo that are added, afterwards. So no, he's just expressing he's expressing a consequence of whatever friction or conflict he and I had while in the studio, which I describe in the book.
You do.
So his memory of that conflict is Kim walking out or not wanting to do this or not wanting to do that. My memory of the conflict is begrudgingly doing stuff, or in some cases choosing not to. So if you explain this real clearly, and hopefully everyone understands it, but if you look at 3 or 4 minutes linearly from start to beginning, then I might be occupying less time if the intro, especially if the intro is long. But if you're looking at how things are stacked vertically, on a horizontal plane, you're going to find a lot of me. So
and that's throughout the.
I think he's conveying his appraisal of the frustration and conflict, and then with given whatever context that his memory would be damaged or that my memory would be damaged.
Because I think his point was that the part that goes with the Leslie effect on Black Hole Sun.
The Leslie effect is all through the song. And here's a point about that. With the Leslie effect, you can only have one guitar.
Right, because you can't match the oscillations.
And I forgot about that. I think I was being interviewed about that with Rick Beato. And, most of these songs have more than one guitar track. There's, like Adam Casper said, there's 2 of me and 2 of Chris, depending on which part of the song it is or whatever. So in that case, I was trying to remember. I remember playing that song and you're trying to track it. And I was like, is there 1 of me and 1 of Chris? Is there 2 of me and 1 of Chris? Is there 2 of Chris and 1 of me? Well, there's just 1 guitar there, because it took me a while to remember that. And the 1 guitar there is Chris. He couldn't even double himself because of the Leslie.
The oscillations of the Leslie.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't match those.
And the conversation went like this. It's pretty funny, but shit, I'm supposed to start another interview.
Uh-oh.
But the funny thing about the conversation, I remember trying to play it and track it, and Chris really wanted me to play the verse part, and you get right near the end, dude, you play these little delicate, fairies on a head of a pin sort of thing, and I get right to the end and fuck up. It's like, oh shit. And then I would say, all right, keep it. It's a long little phrase there. We get to the end. Can you punch me in just like and Michael would say, no. I go, okay, come on, just punch in there. We can't do that. Why can't you do that? It's like, well, we can't do it because, yeah, it's what we've been doing for the whole album. It's what we've been doing in previous albums. Why can't you do that? It's like, we got the Leslie going. I go, oh, so the speaker is spinning. The Leslie cabinet is spinning. You can't just punch in and start recording where you left off or halfway through, because the Leslie effect is going to be in a different, passage in its rotation. And I jokingly said, why can't we just take the speaker, as soon as we cut, just kind of reorient it where it may have been and then start again, or like do a few more takes until it kind of feels right. He goes, no, we can't do it. So it meant that the part had to be from beginning to end. And it was a very delicate, fragile part, especially for someone who plays Beyond the Wheel or Slaves and Bulldozers, or Outshined. And now I'm playing this delicate part. And it got really frustrating. And I was like, shit. And I looked at Chris. I go, why don't you do it? You try it. And Chris is like, no, you should do it. And I was like, this is driving me crazy, because you get nearly to the end of the part. And it's like, that was good. You finished it. But let's try another one, because, maybe I messed up, halfway through or whatever. So we'll try another one. That's the same thing. You get halfway through it or nearly to the end and you have to stop, which, sometimes happens, especially with this part, you start psyching yourself out. So come on, Chris, you try it. So we sit down and Chris starts playing it, and he gets nearly to the end, and he messes up, and he goes, He goes, okay, let's try that again. You get to start from the beginning each time for that whole phrase or whatever verse because of the Leslie. And he starts again and he goes, shit. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to walk outside and get some tea or a glass of water and, give Chris some space, So a couple of us go outside. We're standing out in the lobby, in the lounge, just kind of, whatever, drinking some tea or water and listening. And this is what you hear coming from the control room. Quick! Garrett! Quick! So here's a guy who wrote the song and he's having the same frustration because you can't, normally with any song or riff, you would just say, okay, punch me in there or punch me in halfway through. Right here at the start of this bar, let's take that again because I screwed up this part. But here it's like, you can just get right to the end. And even if you finish it, if you go back and listen, he's like, oh, this part could have been better. You got to start from the beginning. And it was very frustrating. And you can only have one guitar because of the Leslie recording and miking the Leslie. And it has to be a straight performance from beginning to end. So that's the thing about Black Hole Sun. There's just one there, and it's Chris, and it's one performance from beginning to end, and it took a while.
And so just to clarify before I let you go to this other interview, just to clarify super quick. So on those last two records.
In the choruses, there is a Leslie, but it's a slower speed, and then I come in, and I forgot how we did that. I don't know if it's like there couple of me or one of me and one of Chris, or if like one's Leslie and one isn't. I don't remember because you'd think you might develop the same sort of issue with a couple different Leslies going, but it was a slower thing. I'm trying to remember. I know we certainly used it live. You have a fast speed Leslie during the verse and a slow speed Leslie during the chorus. I'm not sure how we navigated like that. It may have just been me during the choruses. Yeah. I don't know.
So, but just to clarify, because I think people can read the book and get maybe the wrong impression for Super Unknown and Upside. Once the intros are over, you and Chris are generally both playing, or you are playing throughout the whole meat of the song. There are complementary parts.
Yeah.
Not just.
Well, it depends. There are songs that Chris didn't play on. I'm not sure if he played on. Like he doesn't play on And Unkind on Down the Upside. On Super Unknown, he does come in on the song Super Unknown, but that's me at the beginning, and then another me comes in, and then he comes in at some point. On Kickstand, I'm pretty sure it's just like 2 or 3 of my guitars, but there may be a Chris on that as well. He may have learned and played that.
So there's nothing that you don't.
It depends on the style part too. I can't think of all the songs right now.
But there's nothing that you don't appear on flat out. Like
no.
Yeah. Okay.
No, but it's more likely stuff that Chris doesn't play on flat out.
Okay.
Like Chris doesn't play on a song Never Machine Forever. He doesn't play on And Unkind. He plays mandolin on Ty Cobb. But I don't
right. Okay, so he doesn't play one of the guitars. I thought that was Ben playing mandolin, but okay. Yeah.
Well, Ben and Chris, there's mandolin and mandola. Yeah, I got to go to this other interview.
Yeah. Good job.
If you want to try to schedule a makeup, we could do that. We could try.
Yeah, we can do that. We can. Okay. I got more. Thanks for following up. I really, really, really appreciate that. I mean, we covered plenty of ground, but there's so much in the book.
I know we were kind of in mid conversation.
Yes.
And I jump. Yeah.
I will quickly finish that thought because I don't want you to dwell on this because I have actually better questions, but I'll quickly finish this thought. And I just have a handful more things I wanted to sort of tie everything up with. We were talking about Upside and how I felt the presentation of it when the album was released was different and the context changed. You did address that. To me,
I was talking about, I've seen so many reviews that say it's the sound of a band coming apart. It's like, no, it's not. We generated 3 videos. I mean, the band has to make these videos. The band then went and did a tour. It's like, and the songs were, they Blow Up the Outside World and Bird in My Hand still gets classic rock radio airplay. It wouldn't have received any if it was the sound of a band coming apart. You know what I mean?
Yeah, to me, it was the way it was presented when it was released during the promotional push, I felt the band did not say this, the label did not say this is my interpretation. To me, it felt like, dude, if we want to be our equivalent of physical graffiti and do whatever the fuck we want with all this stylistic variation, we'll do that.
Yeah.
Like, to me, it felt like a band flexing its muscles creatively.
I think that's what I think you're saying. Yeah, the eclecticism was definitely the band expanding. Things like I love Apple. I wanted to write lyrics for Applebite. I was in the process of doing so. One of the things that was a little bit frustrating is I communicated that to our producer, Adam Casper, and to Matt, because I'd written lyrics for Matt's song "Room 1,000 Years Wide," so I wanted to write lyrics for Applebite, which was again a Matt instrumental. And then like later in the week or next week, I came in and Chris had tracked vocals. I was like, what's going on here? It's like, oh, Chris came in with some lyrics and he tracked vocals. So, but I already told you, the producer, and I already told Matt, and everyone's like, yeah, right on, So why was that not communicated to other band members? But it was a song I loved, but it's very different from other things we were doing. But I loved it so much I wanted to write lyrics for it, and thought I could. It turned out very trippy. There's a Pink Floyd thing to it, and that's kind of what I was hearing, and that's what Chris gave to it. Also in Boot Camp, there's a Pink Floyd thing coming to it. Pink Floyd's been they're very influential with all of us individually. I know Chris had a particular affection for Pink Floyd. I was a little bit more into the Syd Barrett Pink Floyd, like Pipers of the Gates of Dawn sort of period, things like Lucifer Sam and of our writing. The thing that was frustrating to me is that everybody was writing and in many cases demoing with the guitar thing they dialed in for their demo. And I think we were probably successful enough where the individuals started saying, I want this to sound like, what I wrote. It's like, well, that makes me a session guitarist in my own band. In a guitar band that I started, I now have to sound like the drummer's idea of guitar for a song he wrote, and the bass player's idea for guitar, and the singer's idea for who's now playing guitar as well. So that was a little bit frustrating to me, but it didn't stop me from playing the best guitar I could on songs, with material that I loved. I was certainly not happy with what the band should have done is saying, hey, we've been around for a number. Instead, it's like, I wrote a guitar with myself in mind. Now can guitarists change to do that? It was kind of ridiculous because we were a live band. The reason why the White Album worked for the Beatles, and perhaps the reason why Sgt. Pepper's worked for the Beatles, is they very consciously and publicly announced that they weren't going to tour anymore. They weren't a live band. They weren't the band that was playing the bar basement in Hamburg, or the band that was playing Shea Stadium. They dedicated themselves to working with George Martin and becoming a studio band and writing songs not just on their instrument for communicating between musicians or for an audience, a live audience. They're writing songs to then sculpt with other instrumentation and arrangement and effects with tapes and other guitar effects and stuff in the studio for that goal and objective. So there was some interest in doing something like taking the kind of risks that a Sgt. Pepper's or the White Album would take, which have a lot of material that approach different styles. It's like, okay, we're still a touring band and a live band, and we very much come from that place, with our audience, with our peers. The Beatles, of course, were able to take these kinds of risks in the studio with sculpting, and the studio production augmented the writing, which is a different thing. And a lot of experiment with effects and tapes and other instrumentation takes a song and then it then kind of shapes it, sonically for the recorded medium. I think the band thought, well, we can do that. It's like we have better technology and we have this experience. Yes.
And a belief in their own writing, I would think. I would think they felt that too. Yeah,
exactly. And we probably could if we were like the Beatles, publicly announcing that we're no longer going to play live or we're going to be only a studio band. Then the parameters of what we're doing could expand and we could all be on the same page. So in other words, there's things that people wanted, with perhaps not fully fleshing out how to achieve that and how to achieve it in a collaboration or a collective thing. And I don't think any individual, I don't think Matt or Ben or Chris were specifically saying, oh, perhaps Kim is being alienated from this process with his song guitar style and sound, because I don't think any individual was thinking that the other individuals were making similar requests. I was probably the only one. The producer would be aware of that, though. The producer would be aware that Ben wants this to sound like his demo, or Matt wants it to sound like this, or Chris wants it to sound like this. But Chris didn't know Matt and Ben were saying that. Matt didn't know Ben and Chris were saying. Everyone had their own little thoughts about their work or the thing they wrote. So I'm on the receiving end of it, and basically the producer isn't addressing it, or with either with me or with anyone else, and I'm frustrated. Like, well, I don't want to do that. I want to grab my. There's a lot of Telecaster on that album. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, and there's no Telecaster. I think on Super Unknown I might have played Telecaster on a song, maybe. On King Animal I might have played Telecaster on maybe one song, maybe two, but not much. And I just stopped playing them. I don't play any on the recordings we've done with Third Secret or the MC50 project or the new Soundgarden. All my Telecasters are very specific to the down on the upside recording process. And that was to accommodate some of the sounds that people were hearing individually on their demoed songs.
In their vision for those songs.
Yeah. So in other words, I can't fault Matt for a pressure I was getting from two other people, from Ben and Chris as well. I can't fault Ben for a pressure I felt I was getting from Matt or Chris, or I can't, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm the only one who's aware of this coming from other band members, and the producer is aware of these things. So basically, it could have been addressed by either me or the producer. I didn't, other than to get pissed off and say, I'm going to bring in my guitar and I'm going to dial in a sound that I think fits this song, and my bandmates can enjoy the fact that they wrote a song with their other bandmate in mind. So
there's a lot of delicate tones throughout that record.
Lighter single coil tones, yeah.
Right. So devil's advocate though, is it possible that, number one, as you say, they didn't know the other two guys were putting the same quote, you were feeling that pressure from everybody else.
Yeah, it wasn't a collective thing from the band. It was just individual expectations or requests.
So could they have thought, well, wow, Kim interpreted Ben's demo really well, so he would could that have also been a vote of confidence from them?
Yeah,
they were thinking Kim could handle this and stretch.
Yeah, probably. But there are other things that are happening. Like Chris might track a brighter, more delicate sound for like something like Bird in My Hand, and he might track his thing first because he wrote, that guitar part. But then I come in and say, okay, where's the room for, if I get my guitar sound, it's not going to quite fit with what's there. I think Chris played dobro. It's very specifically this metallic sort of acoustic thing. It's like, okay, well, I got to, if the dobro had come later, that would have been a different thing. But because it was first, it's like, well, I have to find where my guitar sound will fit in that song. So
it anchored you to that tonality.
Yes, exactly. It was an anchor. Now that's something I was aware of from playing guitar in a lot of other bands, including the years I played with in Soundgarden. And Chris didn't play as much in the first three records. He gradually started playing more and more as he got a little bit better, and also to accommodate his writing. So it may not have been something that was on his radar to consider. And it certainly was years later when he after he was an Audio Slave, then he called and apologized. I think I mentioned that, or it's in the book.
No.
He eventually called and apologized and said, "Oh, I realized that we were kind of I was kind of changing your sound and the expectation of it, during Down the Upside." And he said, and he apologized for that. He said he realized from Audio Slave, he's like, Tom's got his style and he's got his sound, and there's a way that he likes his guitar to feel and the way he likes it to hear it. And I realized we were kind of, pushing you to try these different things for different kinds of songs. And he apologized. And he basically, I don't think that Chris was fully versed because his voice was his voice. I mean, interpretively, it was his voice, how he heard things, how he expressed himself. The guitar was more for a way to document, and write songs and to document them. They weren't really an expressive instrument for him, but it is for me. So I don't think he really understood that at that time, mostly because he was good. His strength as a guitarist really came from his right elbow, which is his strength as a drummer, right? That years, that we're playing with Tom, that Tom had a familiarity and an acquaintance with his style and song that he was comfortable with. And then Chris thought, oh shit, Kim's the same way. And
that makes sense that he wouldn't have been as comfortable because he joined an established thing. They had their own sort of parameters.
Well, what I'm saying is that he learned something about guitarists that maybe he didn't understand before. You see what I'm saying?
Sure. Yes, I do.
He may have understood it from playing with me, but he was trying to also have himself fit. And then when he played with Audio Slave, he saw that, oh, Tom has something similar. Tom and Kim have a similar approach and familiar intimacy with their instrument and their sound.
Yes.
And so then Chris. It was really sweet that it's one of the things I really love about Chris is he's an accountable person. I know that there's so many people out there who fail to be accountable or responsible for their decisions or actions or behaviors, and Chris was very much that way. And so is Matt and Ben. But Chris specifically, if he realized that, oh, I fucked up or I was wrong, he'd address it, especially with his friends, family, and the band. I would try to do that too. I think we all generally try to do that, but I think mostly it was me and Chris, and then and Scott was kind of that way, and then Matt, you saw that come out with Matt. And Ben was kind of that way, contrition, and you learn and grow and realize, your relationships are dynamic and individuals are dynamic, and you gain perspective. That's one of the strengths of Soundgarden, was that nobody was that autocratic or inflexible. Everyone had some sense of benefit from working with each other. I think there's just some hiccups there as you learn and relationships change and individuals change. There's nothing unique about that. Bands, our band lasted more than 90% of bands, if not a larger number than that. Most bands don't succeed for a duration that is also successful, both creatively and commercially, in a way that we did. So
I have a question about that, since you mentioned, and this is a running theme in the book, that you police yourselves, that you would hold each other accountable. You would say you're being a dick to each other.
We hold ourselves as individuals accountable as well. Yeah.
Right. And you would say to each other, you're being a dick. Like, if one felt as necessary. But you also.
And the point of my saying that is not to call someone a dick in print, but for the reader to understand that we're holding each other accountable. And
yes, that's clear. That's very clear. But you also elaborate on that Chris was at times, or you say he's very astute at reading, kind of empathically, very empathetic. That's not I don't know if that's the term you use, but you said he was very astute with people, his sense of people, and that he would know when to hold back on that too, that maybe it was too much pressure, or maybe somebody needs to sort out what they were going through on their own. So with that being said, you talk in the book about when you made King Animal, there was the same sense of exploration that the band was enjoyed on or went for on Upside, but this time they were respectful of there was communication.
Well, not specifically of me, of each other. I mean, everyone was different. Even the way Ben was to Chris or Matt, or I was to Matt or Chris, it was everyone. We were just older, more mature, but specifically, Matt and Chris had become parents. They become fathers, and there's a whole set of learning from having to nurture, a young being and encourage them through their growth, and you develop a sense of patience as you're imparting your wisdom or sharing with this other developing being. I think that sense of patience and growth that they both learned, they brought to the table, and it was something that I could learn from them, which they had learned from their paternity. And for me, I didn't have kids, but I had a number of pets that were very dependent upon me. Some were go through medical issues, or some have behavioral quirks. You need to accommodate that and be patient and loving, and supportive. And you don't want to, hurt or scare dependents like children, or and then you become more sensitive then to friends and family members. And Chris was kind of the anti-bully, the kind of qualities you might see in someone being a bully. I mean, Chris could be assertive and aggressive and strong-willed, but he did not like being hurt, and he did not like hurting people. And if he felt he had done that, he would be the first to point it out. And Ben and Matt and I would do that as well. Maybe not as quick. Sometimes I have to wait for the steam to come off of me, and then I'd say, I was a dick. I think I might have hurt that person's feelings, and he'd go and try to address it.
How much did you ever consider having children?
Oh, all the time. It doesn't always happen. It's funny. These are conversations you have with friends and family, with your partners, and with our bandmates, and I've known everyone for so long, since we were so young, and there's very clearly parts of our lives where some of my bandmates that we've discussed never wanted to be parents. I don't want to be a parent. Why would you want to bring someone into this terrible world and have to endure all the things that I endured, and force that upon a young kid in a world that's getting worse, politically and environmentally. And I would think, well, I want to be a dad, and I'd like to guide them. But situations, whether it's your profession, your career, where you're at in your relationship, in your life, a lot of these things make it difficult to accommodate it. And I'm not being vague. These are all things that would occur to you as an adult human being. We're in how old are you, for instance?
53, going on 54.
So I turned
12 years younger than you are. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the case of your 40s and 50s, you are dealing with you might deal with sick or aging pets, sick or aging parents, sick or aging relatives. So your partner, in the case my partner had a father who was much older and going through a lot of medical and aging issues, which require a lot of support and attention. Both my parents passed away 3 years ago. They had medical issues, so that sometimes drains your emotional resources as you're attending and you're trying to support, a loved one through their life. There are a lot of factors, and then you couple that with your career and other things, and I'd probably say the majority of my friends did not become parents. They were involved in music or the arts or their careers. A few adopted. A few didn't want to become parents. Some did want to become parents, but the thing is, Chris and Matt both did become parents, and they grew and learned from it. I could see in their patience and their compassion for situations and relationships. It was quite wonderful. After they became parents, you could see that change in their passion and patience. And so I thought that was wonderful. And I think the band were beneficiaries of that maturity and insight. And I think I grew just probably from being older, having being a pet owner and having pets and parents both age and endure medical issues that require attention. But I also saw it was reflected. I observed that with these guys and made note of that as something that I should be aware of with myself. So yeah, that's it. It's a pretty cool thing. It was a trip to see that. I don't remember what else I was saying when I was muted.
No. But I'm curious. How much did the band feel like it had to even broach whatever was going on with Ben that you describe in the book?
Oh, listen, I hope you understand that what I just told you wasn't an addressing of a problem or a situation.
Right.
I'm just trying to tell you about how individuals grow and change.
Sure, of course.
How
that
the
was clear.
Pursuit benefited from that growth and change. I think that's wonderful.
That was very clear,
yeah.
By the way.
Well,
but I'm just curious. When you came back together, much more understanding.
Well, Ben's also grown in how how he addresses issues and problems. Now, remember, there's nothing particularly unique or special about the fact that our band broke up. Obviously, every band except for the damn Rolling Stones didn't breaks up. And the reason why even though the Rolling Stones didn't break up, they did have members pass away, and they had an original member quit. So,
and they also had long time gaps, and they had rifts between them as well.
And the Beatles broke up, and Soundgarden lasted longer than the Beatles.
Yeah, wow. I guess that certainly puts it in perspective. I'm just curious because it sounds like there was just more understanding across the board when everything came back together. There was more of a tenderness, it sounds like, and a more maturity, more mutual appreciation even, or at least being able to express.
I think there was always a mutual respect. That appreciation was definitely felt the second time around. I think the appreciation, and like I said, in the early 2000s when Chris called to specifically apologize for the guitar thing, he had just simply developed a different understanding of the instrument and of how guitarists are, which he even though he played guitar, I wouldn't really have called him a guitarist back then. He was a singer. I mean, his heart and his soul came through his voice. It didn't really come through his guitar. A song could come out from his guitar. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Those last tours that Chris is doing, where he's like after Higher Truth. I mean, he was playing some amazing acoustic guitar, and it was very soulful in the way he was playing it. And there was quite a bit of a difference. And when I saw that tour at Higher Truth, there was he wasn't just a great singer. I could see him then as that his voice, his heart and soul could come out through the way he was playing guitar, and specifically in the way it was accompanying his voice then. And I noticed it.
Yeah, he was evolving as a rootsy. Yes, I understand what you're saying. So, okay. Chris once said years ago, I don't remember if this was this. I think this was right. Soundgarden was still active before breaking up. He said, actually, no, this was long after that. Now that I think about it, but he said, I learned a lot from someone like Kim when I met him. He was very well read. He was, he described you, I think, as worldly and erudite. Maybe he didn't use those exact terms.
When was this?
This would have been around the time of what is that album with the cover of Billie Jean? Carry On, I think.
Oh, okay, right.
Somewhere around there. So 2007-ish, something like that. And he was younger than you, 5 years or so.
No, what, 3 years, maybe 4 years?
Okay, but enough that it was significant. And I wondered about that dynamic, whether he looked up to you initially, and whether you felt that any of that, and
Well, I think we all looked up to each other because there were things I learned from Chris, things I learned from, to this day. There are even what I might order off of a menu, and I look and I do that. And I look and I go, oh my God, I learned that from Chris like 40 years ago. Just little things like that. The things I learned from Hero and Ben and Matt. And yeah, I think Chris probably looked up to me and looked up to Hero. The same token, Chris had a couple of big brothers, and I was a big brother. Hero had a big brother and a big sister. Ben had two big brothers and some big sisters. And I was a big brother, and I felt that sense of duty and responsibility toward my sister. I joke about this. I'm sure I was my sister's protector as well as her tormentor, you know. And in that case, I felt, you know, a love and respect for Chris always in a protective and big brotherly sense. But I was also a peer, you know, and I looked up to him like as if he was a big brother, depending on what the context was. And I could also be a dick. And he could also be. But the thing is, we were in a place where we all recognize in ourselves, like, oh man, I was a dick. So take Chris aside, go, sorry, I said this or did that. I was kind of dickish, you know. And so, do you understand? That's what friends do with friends. If you want to maintain a friendship, is be accountable for the things you say and do.
Yeah, friendships over the ones that last have that element, certainly. Yeah. I was going to ask you how the dynamic in your relationship maybe changed over time, but it sounds to me, from what you describe in the book and from what you're saying now, that you guys were pretty in tune with each other's like essence, for lack of a better word, and maybe what you're saying, there's more compassion, more maturity, but we try to be grown-ups. We try to be sensitive people. We try to be smart people. That's not to say that we fail at any of those above attributes. I mean, we could be stupid, we could be selfish, we can be immature. But as long as we're vigilant about addressing flaws and in our character, you could become a better person. And I think we would have conversations like that. You know, a lot of people like to pat themselves on the back for their successes and point at somebody else in the room for their failures. You know, they say, I failed at this, or I didn't do this because of the way that person was, or because of my boss or my daughter or my son or my parents or my wife or my husband or my, you know what I mean? Or my bandmate. And then when something good happens, they pat themselves on the back and say, I did that. You know, this is my accomplishment. And really, your accomplishments have something to do with your effort and what you want to have happen, and then the people who help you do that. Your failures are, you know, ultimately reflect on missteps you may have made, or perhaps even malicious things you may have done. And as long as you keep that in perspective and hold yourself to account for both your failures and successes, and give credit where credit's due, then, you know, you can have a better understanding of your relationships and the world you're in, and the way you can make the car go now. Well, on that note, how difficult was it for you to disclose or share? There's a lot of interpersonal detail in the book, not always flattering to yourself or to others. There's even the episode with your mom where
I like to put a lot of that in the context of humor, that you know, isn't this funny, or isn't this ironic, or isn't this, you know, and I did laugh at the story with your mom. I don't know if I was supposed to, but I did laugh. Well, certainly that's the humor. It's like, you know, obviously my mom was very much in her own world, and maybe not sensitive to the kind of things that she might do or say. And that helped me be a little bit more sensitive to things like that. Like, oh, here's how my mom's failing, you know, as a mom, or as a person in a relationship with me. You know, how might I address that? You know, what do I need to do? Am I failing in some regard? You know,
the part where you're grabbing the bike after you say to your sister, "I'm going to kill you if you don't let me practice," because she's outside your door.
Yeah, she knows, and I knew that was all complete BS.
And like, you're grabbing your bike, and you say you're fending off her slaps, or
while I'm trying to get the bike out the door.
Right, she didn't let you get anything from the house other than your bike. Like she put you out, but she had the foresight to call your friends and say he might show up on your doorstep. that whole thing made me laugh like multiple times. Like I was like, wow, that's a great story.
There's something crazy and irrational and very mom-like about that.
Yes, very, very like family, like that. Like yes, totally. Like it's totally relatable, even if you haven't been kicked out like that. It was very, very. There's a very universal. So yeah, I'm glad that I wasn't laughing at a part that wasn't meant to be. I was going to ask you one last thing about your parents being Christian. Okay. Speaking of your parents, they were Christian, and you don't reference as much in the book. In passing, you say there's a picture of you with a tie. You say that's the last time I wore a tie.
Yeah.
So graduation or something. How much did that? Clearly, you did not gravitate to being religious. That's clear. But how much interaction, dialogue? What was that like between you and your parents that they were active Christians?
Well, they met in choir. They both sang. My mom's a pianist and singer. They sang my whole life around the house. My mom's read the Bible backward and forward. She would say that, I've read she would just laugh. Well, I've read the Bible backward and forward. She would know all these references. My dad's older brother, who was his best friend, is a Methodist minister. I personally gravitate towards evidence-based inquiry, like science and stuff like that. And so it's a little bit harder for me to accept or believe things that don't have substantial evidence or argument behind it. But that being said, there are a lot of phenomena that we experience that are evident by the experience. Our interpretation may be flawed. We may not know what it is we're experiencing or seeing, but we're attaching a label to it, whether correctly or incorrectly. So some things don't have readily available evidence, or maybe the evidence exists, just not to the instruments of knowledge that we operate, or not to our experience. To kids, a lot of things are fascinating and out of our ken, because there's a lot of things we don't know. And so we interpret a lot of things are strange and bizarre until we understand how certain phenomena work, whether it's weather or the way walls creak or whatever. So I would say it was pretty profound, because any little kid who has to deal with concepts like Santa Claus or God is going to ask their parents, and your parents give you an answer which is from their perspective that can be best conveyed to a kid. And none of my parents, they characterize God as being omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. I never felt scared or threatened by the wrath of God or Jesus, because they're a Christian. I think that whole wrath and fear and fire and brimstone things comes from some weird perversion, where you maintain a flock by scaring them and frightening them to stay, which is also what abusive partners do, right? Don't abusive husbands frighten their wives into staying? And abusive pastors frighten their flock into staying, because the outside world is evil and just covered with devils. And people are they're impressionable. They have emotion. People have different degrees of emotional intelligence, and fear can be quite a motivating factor. So one of the first questions I remember having is, Santa Claus comes down the chimney and puts the gifts under the tree. Yes, Kim. Well, we don't have a chimney. So how does Santa Claus going to come and bring us our gifts? Well, Santa Claus, he can go through walls. He doesn't knock on the door or ring the doorbell. No, he can go through walls. Jesus can go through walls, right? And God can go through walls. Yeah. So Santa Claus like God? If he asks these questions, at some point my dad would say, "Oh, come on, shut up now. Leave me alone. I got to work." And my mom would try to entertain them, like entertaining us, a 5-year-old or 6-year-old or 7-year-old. He's got these questions. How do I explain it? So eventually, some classmate's big brother tells you, "There's no Santa Claus, it's your dad."
So, but that's interesting, because you gravitated to comic
books. And it
books.
is always someone's big brother who tells you there's no Santa.
Yes. But that's interesting, because you gravitated to comic books, which I'm not saying that's contradictory, but it's like there is a sense of wonder and
there's supernatural powers amongst many of these heroes, right?
And there's a desire
they can change time and go fast.
Right. There's a desire to envision.
Apparently.
There's a desire in kids to envision a world where those things are possible. I'm not saying you have to believe them literally, but that's an interesting dichotomy. Last question. Your parents, how much did you get a sense that they felt they were anomalies being Christian in India? And
not at all. That's it. You would say India was part of the British Empire for hundreds of years. The two official languages, India has two official languages, English and Hindi. So everything's written in all the legal papers, political papers, all the signs are either English or Hindi. But there's 14 national languages, Marathi, Urdu, Farsi. So the national languages in total are about 16. And then there's got to be a number of other languages that aren't on that list, but are spoken in certain regions. I mean, there's dialects. It's like India might be the most ethnically and religiously and linguistically diverse countries outside the former Soviet Union. Hinduism from India, Buddhism came from India. Siddhartha Buddha, Jainism, India. Islam.
Jesus himself might have actually borrowed ideas from. Yeah. There's a proposal, a hypothesis that might be.
Yeah, like he might have gone to St. Thomas in the Southwest, in Goa and stuff. Islam is from the same place as Christianity and Judaism. They're the Abrahamic religions. They're from the Middle East. They're from the same location with the same prophets. It's just Jesus and the Virgin Mary are prophets. They're prophets in significant parts of the Quran, as they are in the New Testament. They're not in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus or Mother Mary or anything, but they're in the Christian book and in the Muslim book, because they're all that tradition. It's monotheistic. They're all the children of Abraham, But in India, you have these Eastern faiths. Some are polytheistic, some are pantheistic, whether it's Hinduism is polytheistic and Buddhism. So in India, you have this crossroads between Eastern faiths and then the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths of the Midwest that kind of come into that. So it's very diverse, culturally. Christianity was a very influential and big part of Indian. Like Goa was St. Thomas, supposedly, and the Goa was settled by the Portuguese, even though the rest of it was primarily British. And so you have a strong Portuguese influence there, and St. Thomas and Catholicism, which is a big thing there in the southwest of India. So Christianity was very common. I think a lot of the Indian Christians were probably dispersed throughout the British Empire. And then, of course, my parents ended up in the U.S. instead. But so they're all over, England and whatever the empire was, Canada. And Sikhism is also from India. Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism. I mean, it just seems like the seed of so many different faiths. And Sikhism is monotheistic, so it's an aberration from other Eastern religions, but it's not Abrahamic like the Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Right. Christians, Jews, and Muslims are the Judeo-Christian tradition of those three things, plus Baha'ism and the Coptics. They're all from the same place. They worship the same God. But it's interesting that in India a monotheistic faith comes about that believes in peace and equality, and that's the Sikhs. So you get Sikhs and Christians all around, Canada and England and stuff. So yeah, that was not unusual to me, because those were all my family and friends growing up. I went to church until I said I don't want to go to church anymore. I hated it.
What age were you when you said that?
Probably 7 or 8.
Oh wow! Okay, so that early.
And my parents were like, "Well, we're going to church, so you go to Sunday school." And I just absolutely, I was very upset. I don't want to go and be in Sunday school for hours. There's something about it seemed just dull and stupid and unstimulating. It's unintellectual. Just it was just, I don't know what about it. It just felt creepy to me and unclear, you know. And
I'll tell you what about it. It doesn't encourage inquiry. It doesn't encourage.
And I was a very curious and,
Yes.
and precocious kid, and my questions were often rebuffed, or the teacher was very stern, you know, about my inquisitiveness. And I thought, I don't want to go. And I was very upset about having to go. And my mom looked at my dad and said, he doesn't want to go, hon. He doesn't want to. Don't make him go. It's just he's not going to develop a good relationship with the church if he's miserable, you know.
Well, I'm surprised the Sunday school teacher didn't call your parents and be like, I have a headache trying to debate this kid. So get him out of here. Please don't send him back to
That may have been what it was. It may have been what it was. My mom would answer my questions. The Sunday school teacher and the pastors weren't as convincing or satisfying.
Right. That stuff doesn't encourage, if you're going to have this
passion. It's dogma. It's not.
Right.
It's not intellectual at all. It is,
or even spiritual. It's not spiritual either. It doesn't encourage a passion for anything that a religion purports to be. It doesn't hand that over to a child and say there's wonderment, there's awe, there's reverence.
Yeah.
The way it's just like it's just like being in math class in second grade, which is not even that fun, actually. For anybody who's inquisitive, Sunday school is like a spiritual implosion or death. It crumbles. My dad is Maharashtrian. I did not grow up with my dad, so I don't have much connection to my Indian heritage. My mother's from Puerto Rico.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, Reyes Kulkarni. I added my mom's name to my pen name.
So you're part Indian and part Puerto Rican. So
yes.
A little bit Catholic and a little bit
So my dad, I don't think my dad is really a practicing devout Hindu. I don't think he's an atheist either. My dad's a doctor, and I didn't grow up with him. So I grew up Catholic, and I also had some exposure to Santeria too, which is a Caribbean, Latin American, African, Yoruba.
Oh, you know, the Santeria is I know that. Yeah, it's Catholic. I'm aware of Santeria. You know,
so I had some exposure to that, and but my dad did tell me. He said, "Imagine the racial complexity of the U.S. and magnify it times 100 or something like that." And that was Indian. He's like, that's like it is multidimensional. Many different ethnic groups. What languages did your parents speak?
English. Period. My mom spoke a little bit of French since she was minoring in that. So just English. My paternal grandmother spoke 10 languages apparently. Many different Indian languages. My grandfather also was a polyglot, you know, from a number of different Indian languages. And my grandfather worked for he was a postmaster, so I'm sure he had to be acquainted with a number of different languages as well. Some of my aunts and uncles spoke other languages, but my parents, English only.
Okay, wow.
They might have gone to a different school than, I think they did go to a different school than some of their younger siblings, but my father's younger siblings. All my mother's siblings, and they came from large families, they all spoke English. You know, it's very interesting you're talking about the tradition, because it seems like in the tradition with Hebrew and Muslim tradition seem to have this intellectual and academic richness throughout their history over hundreds of years, and you see it you don't see in the Christian church. You see sort of a suppression of that in the general public, but not amongst like the clergy, who are often the only people who are literate and can read, and often the ones who can afford or possess a telescope. So you get these great astronomers, you know, and philosophers that come out of the Christian tradition, but the flock are not encouraged in that way. And so I almost think that the clergy might have been encouraged by wealth or the king or the monarchy more so than the faith. But it's just interesting that in the Jewish and Muslim tradition, you have this intellectual, you know, inquiry about sciences and math, and it's very interesting, and an appreciation for art. But in the same token, there are these doctrinaire, conservative, suppressive elements in both Judaism and in Islam, and it tends to be on the right. So right wing Islam, right wing Judaism both seem to share something with a big bulk of mainstream Christianity in suppressing inquiry. Although each of them have even though it's very interesting that so much of the body of human knowledge comes from or has been if it didn't originate from that particular faith, then perhaps that faith was a custodian of it in the case of Islam or Hinduism or Judaism. There's certainly eventually there's a tradition of underwriting of arts and sciences that come from the Christian church, but it's really unusual because it was definitely it was reserved for the clergy and for the crown, kind of.
Yeah, almost like an academic class of clergy, and what you're describing in religion. I mean, for a one-time philosophy major, and somebody who was reading Superman comics, goes to Spinoza from that on that trajectory. I could see theology or theosophy. That's actually not the correct term, but the combination of theology and or being a theologian and philosophy and inquiry really appealing to someone with your type of curiosity, except that the doctrinaire, the dogmatic angle of religion, there's always that element, like an authoritarian element, almost like a right-left struggle within religion. Every religion has that, so maybe every society has that as well.
I gotta look this up, but I think Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he was a philosopher, but he's Christian. He was I think he was a clergy member, but also a writer. My mom had a number of books by him, and I remember. I remember when I was getting interested in philosophy, I thought, I should read some of that. But from what I understood, that it came from a religious tradition, which I could see having its appeal to my mom. But I ended up never reading it. But I just remember that,
I'm familiar with the name. I've never read any of his stuff, but there is a surprising amount of that kind of thing from people with religion. You mentioned the bond between religion and science was also much more solid than we currently understand. How much have you wanted to go to India to reconnect with your background or
I was curious. I mostly wanted to go and see relatives, my grandparents, meet some uncles and aunts and cousins. That's mostly. It was really about my, my family, and also I thought that perhaps in India I was more likely to see exotic animals, and if I was lucky, a dinosaur. I mean, there weren't any jungles in the U.S., but there are jungles in India, and I thought, oh, cool. Maybe I'll meet a dinosaur or a tiger or an elephant. I was a little kid, so basically, I wasn't as excited about going to a place that wouldn't have baseball or TVs with cartoons or comic books. And as a kid,
and you didn't like the food as a kid. You hated the food as a kid.
It's hot and spicy. So what I come to learn, however, is that my parents grew up with Captain Marvel and Superman, and they had, in the 30s and 40s or whatever, they had comic books in India, and they had a popular music. So that's the surprising thing is there's a guitar up on the wall at my grandparents' house, and my cousin plays it. There's a record player, there's a bunch of Beatles records and Johnny Cash and stuff. And so I go to India thinking no baseball, no superheroes or color TV or anything. That's a negative, but I got some family members and perhaps dinosaurs. That was a positive. So does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, as an adult, it doesn't sound like you feel this pull to go and
I think no, because it wasn't part of, it was my parents' home. It wasn't mine. Like I said, I was there once when I was 8 years old.
Right. It's in the book.
Yeah. So I mean, no, I don't. I think with some of my relatives, some of my cousins, my aunts and uncles, they might have more of a sentimental, nostalgic pull there. I don't. You know, the kind of things I'm interested in. You know, I'm not particularly religious, so I mean that'd be great if I wanted to indulge that aspect of culture and history. I mean, I would like to go there, but I mean, not for any of the reasons that you might suspect. So, I mean, I'd go there I'd be as excited to go there as I would be to go to Japan again, you know, or something. So,
yeah, it would have been cool to play there if Soundgarden had gotten a chance to play there. I always tell people, with some amusement, that a lot of the quote unquote Eastern sounding element of Soundgarden, other than things like Flower that sounds kind of drony where you're blowing on the pickups and beyond the wheel, other than some of that earlier stuff, which to me actually sounds closer to post-punk than drony sitar like stuff.
Yeah.
But I always tell people a lot of the Eastern sounding stuff in Soundgarden that you would assume sounds Indian is actually from Ben and Chris.
No, I don't think that's true. I think all of us, and it would have come from the Beatles, you know, through all of us.
Okay.
I mean, certainly there's some Eastern sounding things like in the song like Suicide, which Chris wrote, or in the song
Half
by Ben. Yep. There's some, but then again, you know, 1,000 Days Before is something I wrote in the mid-90s. You know, Flowers, a piece of music that I wrote.
Sure.
Really something Eastern in that. There's other things that were written that we never released or were recorded, which I wrote, which might have had a little bit of that in there. So Chris is certainly borrowing that from his love of the Beatles, as is Ben, as is myself, and Zeppelin. You know, Zeppelin certainly would incorporate some of those elements too. So, yeah. So the fact that we were in a band that regarded that element in, you know, certainly in popular music, and it was willing to incorporate what we did was certainly a shared pursuit. I think Matt and Hero may not have ever written anything with that kind of drone or sympathetic notes. You know, I think it was always, and you know, it's always Chris and Ben and I. Chris,
and even in Dusty,
well, Ben and I were the more experienced guitarists, you know, during that period. So, and we both had Beatles, you know, roots. So
there's also that part in Dusty that that sounds very Eastern to me, and very.
That was Ben wrote that.
Right.
I'm going to have to jump and plug my laptop in and go to the bathroom. And
that was my last question. Listen, thank you for following up. This was really, this was more rich, and a real pleasure. And
well, thank you, Sammy. It sounds like you can't get all of this into one article, so.
It'd be great to double dip and wheel it.
You'll have to distill it down to something.
Kim features. If you could have potentially, if your manager could point me to your liner notes for "Oh No, It's Devo" and maybe send them to Megan, not for the article, just for my own. Maybe I can find those online.
It was "Oh No, It's Devo" came out on Infinite Zero, and there was a printing and run that had my liner notes in it, and I probably have like 2 CD copies. I never got it on vinyl, so you might be able to find it online. My manager's not going to have that because I wrote those in the early '90s, and our current management's been with us since 2019, 2020, I think 2019.
Well, maybe another time, at some point down the road, maybe I can pick your brain about Devo. I'd be really curious.
I love Devo. Yes, if you ever do a piece on Devo, call me.
I will do that. That's the first record I got. Whip It, and I forgot what the B-side was, and then Freedom of Choice was. I was 8 years old.
Oh wow!
When I got Freedom of Choice, and then I set it aside as a teenager, and then I heard a housemate of mine in my early 20s had Devo, and I said, "Fuck! I had actual taste." I saw them on the show Fridays. They played Uncontrollable Urge in the yellow suits.
Yeah,
I could go on and on about that band. I'm not a super aficionado, but
I had that album. I was 17 or 18.
Yes, because you're born in 1960.
Brian Eno record,
yeah. What a. I will do a piece on Devo and request.
There's a band that used weird, time signatures, and it sounded completely natural, cool grooves, you know.
So much there, and they're such a product of their place. I've said before, if those guys,
Ohio,
yes, I'm like, if those guys didn't discover music, they would have gotten in trouble, like building bombs or something. There's an anger in their music that I love because it's not apparent on the surface.
Yeah.
That album, New Traditional, is so dark. It's so fucking dark, and the lead guitar player, Bob Mothersbaugh, just so economical and amazing.
Yes, I agree. Bob won. Bob won. Amazing. Yeah. They're both great, but Bob Casale is passed away, R.I.P. Well, I'm going to have to plug this in.
Yes, I will write a piece on Devo and request to talk to you about it. It'll be a pleasure. Thank you. This is going to be awesome. Sonny. All right, take care. All right. That's hilarious. I'm going to have to plug my battery, and it's like, let the man go to sleep already. You're still here, and if you've been watching the whole time, thank you. I know that's a lot to digest. It's over 2 hours of rather in-depth conversation. I am, of course, going to break that up into smaller chunks, but I really, really, really appreciate those of you who've been here and who commented. Whoops, shoot. What's music playing? Are you hearing music on here? There we go. Okay. The music you're hearing is from a show that took place 32 years ago today, as a matter of fact. It is the anniversary of the date, the second to last date, when Soundgarden, 11, and Tad played St. Paul, Minnesota. They toured the states together in the summer of 1994 after Super Unknown, and that's what you're hearing now, although I don't know how loud it is over my voice. Let's see. And so I thought I'd play a little bit of that. You can actually hear all 3 sets from all the bands on the Fuzz Monster YouTube. There's a lot of stuff from that era on that channel. I couldn't recommend it more. The quality of the recordings are great. All right, so let's fade that out. The first thing that jumps out at me from this interview, and actually from reading the book as well, the one takeaway from Thayil's book, A Screaming Life, which is out now, by the way, and I have read it and listened to it. If you're a fan of the band, I could not recommend it more. But my main, the one thing that's like right there is his resistance to adapting his guitar approach to suit the way the rest of the band was broadening its creativity, and the fact that they wanted him to do that and they were soliciting his participation. So I went back and listened to the album Down on the Upside in full about a week ago or so, and I expected to go back and feel like Kim's presence on the album is diminished and that he had receded into the background, and that's actually couldn't be further from the truth. I'm pretty sure I have an 85% confidence that I can tell which guitar player is doing what, whether certain guitar parts are his versus Chris's. I can't always tell 100%, but it sounds to me like he's all over that record. His touch is all over it. There's so many moments, many moments throughout the songs where he's putting this really lovely color guitar, as he called it, these textures and these atmospheres. And the band and the person they were using as a quote-unquote producer, although they self-produced the album, he's more like a production assistant, Adam Casper. They managed to like almost put his guitar style through a diffuser and make it more spacey and airy. There was some of that quality to his sound from the very beginning. On the song you just heard, Flower, that's an earlier song of theirs, when he was the main, or mostly the sole guitar player in the band, and it has that ringing kind of chimey kind of thing that he did. But Steelopus or not Steelopus says, dude, are you sitting on a treasure trove of these older interviews with musicians? I absolutely am. I have 20 years worth, and I need an editor like, I don't know, like a fish needs water or something. Like I am slow at editing, although I edited this one at lightning speed for me. I did it in like a few hours, which to me is like being in warp drive. But yes, thank you, Steve. I have a gigantic archive, including 2 interviews with Chris Cornell and 2 previous interviews with Kim Thayil, which I'll tell that story in a second, and how that led to these 2, or this set of interviews. But so they managed to diffuse his style and apply it in all these different like shades on that record. And I also don't concur with his, like, I'm stumped. I'm like scratching my head at like, how did you think this was disrespectful? Because from my perspective, the finished product on that record, it seems very clear to me that they were like, no, we want you to bring your thing into our respective creative visions, not in a way that diminishes you or where we're asking you to be less creative. Where they were actually asking him to be more creative and use his style and approach as a springboard to other things. As somebody who plays guitar, and I'm not nearly as developed a guitar player, my guitar playing is like, you give a chimpanzee 2 rocks to bang together, and that's my guitar style. It's a little more like intentional than that, but and there is subtlety to it, but it's very, very, my guitar style is very limited. There's like constraints, and I find it challenging to stretch and warp what I do, kind of like silly putty, to match any given situation. And I find it really gratifying and flattering if someone asks me to do my thing, or even if they just give me room to do my thing, and then they go, oh, that fits what I'm doing. And I just don't get how he still, to this day, like 3 decades later, 30 years we're talking plus since that record was made, he still holds to this idea, and it's in the book. At that point in the book, like, and he said it here in this interview, I felt like a session player in my own band. And that to me is an upside down view of what happened, because I don't feel like they were like, no, do this simply because I want my vision executed. It's like, oh, my demo has like this kind of, this kind of quality to it. It's papery or whatever. I still want you, but I want you within that context, almost like taking an actor who's excellent and giving them different roles to play, or different films, or different scenery, different backdrop, and say, okay, hey, well, I'd like you, awesome actor, who I think highly of. I think this is the band, I think, their view of him. I'm speculating here, but I, from watching bands work, this does not sound to me like the product of somebody getting shoved to the side, so much as the product of, no, you're an integral part of what we do. Now we just want to change the backdrops. We want to give you different guises to wear, and we think your skill set calls for this, and he resisted that. And if, again, I don't want to spoil the book too much. I mean, if you already listened, there's been spoilers. I meant to issue a spoiler warning at the top, and I think I forgot it. That's kind of what broke them up. It's not like only that, and it's not entirely clear, right? Because this band, I've never encountered a situation where a band has been more tight-lipped about what split them apart. When they announced their breakup in April of 97, it was like, whoa, what the fuck? Like where did that come from? And I've long suspected, I've said this on the channel, that they signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. This is just a hunch. I've never seen any suggestion from anybody else about that, but just how unnaturally silent they were about their breakup. And they stayed that way even after getting back together. They never divulged almost nothing about the dynamics that led to suddenly we're pulling the plug and we've had 3, platinum albums in a row. Now, you could say that Down on the Upside, or one must acknowledge that it only sold a fraction of what Super Unknown did in the States. But as I've also pointed out on the channel, and I think in pieces I've written as well, several of those bands were going through the same thing. Pearl Jam sales went down. Stone Temple Pilots, who I don't put necessarily in the same category as Soundgarden, but their sales went down. I believe Smashing Pumpkins by 1997 were experiencing something similar. These alternative guitar-based, quote-unquote, alternative 90s bands. The paradigm was shifting. The landscape of music was clearly shifting. I remember many articles from that time period starting to cover in music magazines electronic acts. And it was really, really funny because there was some spin year-end something poll, or the editors had a list or something, and somebody said something like, one of their contributors said something like, thousands of people bought this CD by the band Prodigy, and 100,000 people bought the CD, and 99,000 of them were writers who were writing a piece called "Is Electronica the Next Big Thing?" Because I remember seeing that in a bunch of magazines. And then there was the whole Britpop thing. 5 years is a long time, 5.5 years from late 91 to 97. It's a long time for a trend. That's right around the time where trends go belly up, and then, there's a crop rotation and something new comes in. I forgot where I was going with this, but I think that may have played a role as well. Interestingly, because I've always wondered about this, and I got to ask Kim Thayil this the last time I spoke to him. I'd always wondered what was the mood in the infrastructure of these bands, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, STP, because again, Soundgarden, Super Unknown sells 5 million in the US, certified quintuple platinum. It's number 1 on the Billboard charts. Pearl Jam has 10, and they have Verses, which sell like hotcakes. Nirvana obviously has Nevermind and In Utero, and Stone Temple Pilots, their first 2 records go multi-platinum, and then the 96 record, which actually happens to be my favorite, only goes single platinum. So there's this clear trend in terms of sales across this whole section of the music store, right? And I've for many years I wondered, what were these labels? What were the meetings like at these labels? What was the vibe with these managers, with these booking agents, with these bands going out on the road? And yeah, they're going platinum, but it's clear that they're not the cash cow they once were. You can see where things are headed. Was there a sense of, okay, we're kind of under siege here? Was there a sense of pressure in the internal machinations of the teams around these bands? And when I spoke to Kim Thayil the last time around the 20th anniversary vinyl reissue of Down on the Upside, he acted like, or he said that that they weren't concerned with sales. And in the book, he even refers to Down on the Upside as a successful album, a hit album, and that they were doing well on the road. So that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't the case. It doesn't necessarily mean their management wasn't like, okay, we're nervous here. Or were the labels like, hey, listen, we know grunge is dying. You're still selling 1 million records. That's good enough for us. So just keep selling as much as you can, and we're good with it. Because I remember the promotional push for that album, and I hinted at this when I was talking to Kim, just being like, they were on so many magazines, the cover. There were 3 MTV half-hour specials leading up to the album. They were on radio shows. To me, it seemed like, okay, this is going to be the unveiling of this big ticket item, this major league band. They had the promotional muscle and machinery behind them of a major label act. I could tell the labels expected, okay, we're going to have another big hit here. And I wonder if somehow the changing tide darkened what was already a band, I don't want to say in free fall, but having troubles. And again, I walked away from the book thinking he's the main reason why this rift occurred. He was the one who was kind of dragging his feet. Now, in bands, you have this healthy push-pull. You have people who want to expand and try different things, and you have people who are like more quote-unquote conservative, or like, well, that's not really what we do. That's not really in keeping with who we are artistically. And that push and pull often creates some really vibrant results. I think it is often the case that musicians, such as Kim Thayil in this case, can end up being pushed out of their comfort zone and look back on that experience and say, no, that wasn't really natural to me. But where I, as a listener, love the results. I adore all these little frills and touches that he put on that record, whether he was, whether he did it kicking and screaming and dragging his feet the whole time. It doesn't really matter. I mean, the very beginning of that album, that that spray, like he uses the wah to make that guitar sound like it's like spraying. It's just beautiful. It's really, really deep and colorful, and it's almost tactile, his playing on it. And I think that, him saying, no, I wanted to do my thing and they should have respected my thing. It's like, well, his sense of his playing is very limited, I think, in a strange way. And the other big takeaway from the book, this recurs, he says it multiple times in the book, and he said it here, is I couldn't disagree more with his assessment of Chris Cornell's guitar playing. He's like, well, he's more of a functional guitarist who's, doing a strummy kind of keeping time thing to serve his song or to serve his vocal. His voice was his voice, not his guitar. I think that's not at all how I've seen them. In fact, once you get into the Ben Shepherd, Cornell, Thayil, Cameron lineup of the band, I felt like everybody in that band was a secret weapon. In other words, everybody brought something to the table that you wouldn't necessarily point to that specific thing as the thing that stands out the most, but everybody brought something integral to their overall sound that is maybe a little more subtle in its value. And obviously Chris's voice, that roar that he has is very, very prominent. It's one of the first things you notice about the band. And that's, that sticks out, but his guitar playing, I thought was very expressive and had a lot of artistry and was very quirky. And you get the sense in the book that he just resisted, like he just didn't see that the whole time. He even says it here. He's like, well, when Chris did Higher Truth, then I thought, oh, wow, now the guitar is part of his voice. It's like, dude, his guitar was his voice as far back as a song like Hands All Over. Some of those like almost shoegazy kind of things that they had going on was the interplay between both of these guitarists. And I love how they became a 2-guitar band with 2 very quirky, unorthodox, distinctive guitar players who on paper you kind of feel like maybe shouldn't have matched each other. Like they should have been a mismatch. There's a clip of Michael Beinhorn saying, wow, Kim's rhythm guitar tone was like one of the worst guitar tones I ever heard. And I kind of know what he's saying. He had a very brittle, kind of caustic thing that wouldn't necessarily, you kind of would have to work to chisel his style and Chris's style to fit together, but they did it. And I think they did it extremely well on that last album. And it's interesting to me that it's still a point of contention for him. And it's what set up their reunion being so positive, because he felt that wasn't the case. They were doing different things and doing all sorts of exploration on King Animal, but they were doing it in a way that he felt was more acknowledging, and the word he used, respectful of him and his voice on the guitar. Interesting stuff. And he actually downplays his own guitar value and doesn't say much about the development of his guitar style in the book at all, which really shocked me. So if you're like a Guitar World guitar player kind of reader, who was reading about these guys like in those magazines, or Guitar for the Practicing Musician, that magazine isn't around anymore. But if you're into reading bands or magazines like that hone in on the technique, he does not mention his technique once in the book, which is really odd. And then he refers to himself as like, yeah, I'm a good guitar player. I even think it's strange that he refers to, you heard him just do it just now, keeps referring to what he did as riffs. I don't see Soundgarden as just a riff band. Yes, there are obviously riffs in there, but he talks about that all the time, like riffs. His style was there was more to it than that. There was much more texture to what he himself did, even when he was the sole guitar player. You go back and listen to the EP, Screaming Life, which is what he considers the first album, and I do as well, because they recorded enough material for that to be their first album. And it was either Poneman or Pavitt. I think it was Bruce Pavitt who was like, no, we want to put that out as an EP. And then eventually they tacked another EP onto it named FOP, which is their Ohio Players cover. So by the time I heard Screaming Life, it was on a CD with a full length's worth of material on it. And I always considered that their first album. But if you listen to that, he says in the book he loves the way it sounds. I do as well. Even though it's all the way at the other end of the spectrum from Down on the Upside, I love those both for their respective the difference in the production values and the sonic palette. He's got a lot of like interesting, like his guitar can be kind of smoky in places and occupy the music kind of like this like mist above it. And so for him to keep referring to that as riffs just seems very, almost like he doesn't even grasp the value of his own playing either. So it's like he's downplaying Chris's guitar playing, but he's also downplaying his own as well. So that's very interesting. You know, there isn't a ton of juicy detail in the book, but the reason I couldn't put it down is each chapter builds up into the next one. Hinted at this a little bit in the conversation, but Adam Tepedlin made each chapter like the payoff for the climax of the chapter before, and that's hard to sustain throughout a whole book, and it pretty much does that. And, you know, this is the most we've ever gotten by orders of magnitude. Like, this is exponentially more detail than anybody has ever publicly put out there about what broke them up and about their interpersonal dynamic. There's not a ton of detail about that either. He starts getting into it once things start to go wrong with Hiro Yamamoto. He starts to pull back the curtain a little bit on that, and then later with himself and the direction of the band, and then with Ben, when Ben starts having his outbursts. You know, there's that infamous moment that was widely reported. I remember reading about it in Rolling Stone. The last show they played in Hawaii in February of '97, where Ben threw his bass. It's one of the climactic points in the book. It actually is, in a sense, the climax of the book. And I won't divulge too much. But, you know, 2 weeks after that, I'm going to show you this clip of Chris Cornell. 2 weeks after that, he was talking, you know, at the Grammys. He was interviewed. Somebody put a camera, a microphone in front of him, and he was acting like they were about to go back and do another record. Check it out.
Soundgarden is up in, I think, a lot of people would say one of the more competitive, one of the best talent represented categories tonight, the hard rock category.
Yeah.
All right, let me fast forward here.
Or
Yeah, for the amount of time we
Here.
Jones to get back recording, you want to just take time off at the moment, or?
Yeah, for the amount of time we spend not recording, it kind of seems silly because, you know, that's what bands do. They make records, and people write songs, make records. Seems like we don't spend enough time doing that. So hopefully we'll be doing that real soon.
You look like you got some sun somewhere.
Yeah, it's that.
Man, hopefully we'll be doing that real soon. That is so unfortunate. You know, I'm going to play you the MTV news brief, the announcement of their breakup, because I mean, it really does mark the end of an era. Check it out. This is Kurt Loder. You remember? This is Kurt Loder with an MTV news brief. Doom, 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 with the little typewriter thing. Man, those were awesome. So here we go.
He's slowly receding into rock history. Soundgarden.
I hate Instagram, how it like...
He can rock. With the grunge period of the early 90s slowly receding into rock history, Soundgarden, the metal-edged Seattle band, called it quits this week after 12 years and one chart-topping album. No reason was given, just a terse notice through the group's record company that the split was amicable and mutual. Here's a look back at the band that was.
You know, he's right. That statement that they released was 18 words. It is the most, like, terse is the perfect word to describe it. It's the announcement they made when they broke up said nothing. And again, they maintained this like wall of silence about this for a long time. Check this out. Here's an interview they did for the Guitar Center YouTube, where they're asked point blank about the breakup in 2014. So they've been back together for 4 years. They're rolling along. They've done an album. You'd think at this point they could be like, yeah, this is what was going on. You know, we can sort of let you in on things a little bit. Check out how much they say and how little they reveal in this when they answer this question. They're open to the question, but they smoke screen it the whole way. Check it out.
Dan, on the upside, continued your success, more platinum album sales and big tours, and then you broke up. Why?
Not selling enough records, I guess.
I think we had that kind of has
down on the
mostly to
outside.
do with the fact that it was, though it seems like a weird time for a band to split up, we'd been a band since 1984. And it wasn't until the early 90s that we had reached a large audience. So it was fairly recent that the audience in the size that we had even knew about us, but it wasn't fairly recent that we were a band making records, recording and touring, you know, and also there was a transition from being an indie band where virtually everything was done based on what the four of us decided we wanted to do and how we did it, even to being our own roadies, to then having a periphery of people needing to meet schedules, make decisions. And some of that is just the nature of how things are when your audience expands and you sell more records. And some of it was just the fat of a stupid industry that is now dead because of it.
So was there a level of disenchantment with?
Yeah. Whatever. Blasey, blah. I mean, yeah, those are fair points, but it doesn't. You read the book, and there was more going on there, which thankfully he finally at least gave us something to hang our hats on. Gave us a glimpse. It's not gory. You don't get many arguments. You don't get many confrontations. I didn't even really get a sense of what their personal rapport was actually like, what their personal chemistry overall, even the positive side of it, was like. He compliments Matt Cameron for being easy to get along with, but doesn't use examples to illustrate why that would be. You know, I wish Adam Tepedlin had really pressed him to spice things up, to give us, again, more illustrations, more flavor for what these guys were like on the road, out in the world. I mean, by all appearances, they didn't look like the most fun bunch of people to be around. In fact, a lot of times they seemed extremely aloof, like total dicks, actually. I've watched a bunch of interview clips of them from the 90s. And if I had been working, doing music articles at the time, I'd be like, I don't want to go near those dudes with a 10-foot pole. Even as much as I love their music, they're one of my favorite bands. They just had a really sour, uninviting disposition that a lot of times looked kind of put on. Like they either put on or self-inflicted or both. Like maybe they felt like they needed to come across that way and be sort of oppositional. Like, they were on Lollapalooza, they were bitching and complaining about it, how they thought it was PC hippie, culture, and they felt like it was empty. And it's like, all right, well, why are you here then? And eventually that bled over into their performances. I mentioned this in the interview, but if you see old footage, so I actually saw them in person. I saw them in January of 1990. I saw them again sometime in 1990. So I saw them the first time I saw them, they were on the middle slot on the, very storied Voivod Soundgarden Faith No More bill. That was in January at the Ritz in New York City. Then I saw them at the Beacon Theater open for Danzig. Then I saw them at the second Lollapalooza. And then I saw them headline with Eleven and Tad here in Rochester, New York, at a place called the War Memorial, now the Blue Cross Arena. And there was a noticeable change in their disposition. Up until 1992, so that when they were touring Bad Motorfinger, there was a real hunger in their, like, you got this sense of hunger, like, we're going for it. Like, not only going for it in this live performance right in front of you, but there was a sense of, like, this band that had this momentum that was striving to achieve, and you could see that in the live performances. By 1994, all the footage I've seen, I've listened to, audio. There's tons of audio on archive.org. There's great stuff on YouTube. they just seem so weighed down by just everything. And there are, you know, certain magical moments, I think, in those shows. But it just seemed like a very, very unhappy camp. And I would have wanted a better sense of what it was they appreciated about each other and why they fit together as people, because that's the thing he stresses in the book. You know, we were sometimes cantankerous. You know, we were strange people. We were difficult to get along with. We were sometimes ornery, but we fit each other. And it would have been nice to have a better idea of why that was, but I'm not complaining, because I've waited years and years. I've waited decades to understand what the hell happened there. And now with the book, you get a much clearer sense. It's not explicitly all spelled out in gory detail, but you get a pretty clear sense. You know, I'm not sure Thayil would even say this himself, but he was a huge part of why that all came apart. The friction, you know, between where he didn't want to go and where they wanted to go, and his he describes it as alienation and how disconnected he was emotionally. That played a big role, a huge role, if not the major thing that drove them apart. And I think they still had, you know, another great record in them. At least, you know, they could have, had they weathered that storm, it would have been really interesting to see where they went, because I am actually not a fan of what Chris Cornell did on his own. He's one of my favorite artists ever. I mean, I put him up there with, like, you know, as the level of talent, or my appreciation for him as like a Van Gogh or somebody like that. Really an enormous talent, but I've never connected with what he did on his own much. And it was like a immediate drop off. You know, what I love about this band is that they were truly a band. They almost relied on each other for a creative spark and a chemistry, and something, the word I used to describe it was ineffable in their chemistry that none of them took with them elsewhere. Although you find some of it on the Hater stuff with Ben Shepherd. But, you know, 2 years later, Chris Cornell looks gaunt. He looks like, you know, like sickly and, you know, unhealthily thin, almost skeletal. And you see where he's going on that solo stuff on Euphoria Morning. And it's like, it lacks so many of the qualities that made the band special, in my view. There are moments, there are things about it I like, but I feel like he wasn't who he was to me, the artist that I love and admire so much outside of this band. Mason Maiorino says, I do like Audioslave though, but yeah, on his own, I was not really interested in his solo stuff that much. You know I should say, one of his most powerful lyrics to me is an Audioslave song named Show Me How to Live. The chorus in that, nail in my hand from my creator, you gave me life, now show me how to live. That is a super powerful lyric. I just got the chills even thinking about it. It's very direct from him. Like, some of my favorite stuff by him is much more impressionistic, like, you know, walking a tightrope with 10-ton shoes and things like that, things that are more abstract and there's imagery involved. But I absolutely love that lyric. I think he was more of a band guy than maybe he thought of himself. Definitely a singer-songwriter, definitely the primary driving force. That's another thing in this dynamic that is important and that Thayil is subtle about, but references over and over. You know, initially it was Kim Thayil and Hiro Yamamoto writing the songs, and then gradually Cornell starts to write more and more and more on his own until he's dominating the process. Now, I should say, one of the things that I feel so fortunate, that I feel we are so fortunate about with that band, is that number one, they got Ben Shepherd into the band, and he was Hiro Yamamoto's ultimate replacement. They had Jason Everman in the middle there, but really, really powerful, creative mind who instantly like made everything click. And thank goodness, I feel like they gave him room, Ben Shepherd, to contribute creatively. Once he joins for Bad Motorfinger, he's writing multiple songs per album. By Down on the Upside, he wrote almost half the album himself. As Chris wrote, a little more than half. Ben Shepherd wrote a bunch on his own. Wasn't really a bass player, but a super unique bassist. He was more of a guitar player, and then he just picked up the bass to join Soundgarden. Has a really distinctive approach, like his own angle on the bass, and several of my favorite songs by them were written by him, and I thought he really made them a band, Ben Shepherd, and I am eternally grateful, especially when I listen to Down on the Upside. I'm like, man, it's so awesome that they gave this guy as much room as he wanted, it sounds like, to really bring all these new flavors and colors and vibes to their music. And so I thought he was an excellent counterpoint to Chris's songwriting. And the great thing about them is that they never got fully dominated by Chris. They never became a vehicle or a solo vehicle for Cornell's singer-songwriting. And they all maintained their distinct character as players and as creative people. Even if Thayil wasn't writing that much towards the last few records, his approach is so unique that, Chris Cornell, without the character of these people and without this four-way chemistry, just kind of lacked way too much in my view. Let's see. Mason says, one thing I can respect about Chris is he never made anything about himself, which he could easily have done given that he was the guy from Soundgarden. Yeah, good point. I should give the background for how we got here to begin with. So let's see, did I cover all the bases? I'll make one more point about well, the one question I kicked myself for not asking, which was teed up perfectly for me, and I wanted to ask it in the moment. But sometimes you're in the flow and you don't want to throw somebody's train of thought off. I did interrupt more in this interview than I initially thought, but it was usually to prove that, I've read the book. Like, hey, you said this in the book, and I'm really a stickler about interviewers interrupting way too much. They do it way too much. And they completely like interject something that has nothing to do with what's being stated. But when Kim was saying, I could have talked to them about it, I chose not to, and instead I got pissed off. The question I was dying to ask was, why? What stopped you from asking them or from saying something? What stopped you? And I wish I had, but it just the train was already rolling, and it didn't feel right to interject that in the moment. And then once it was passed, it was like, well, but that's what I would really love to know the most. Now, I also did not get to ask questions that I had been dying to ask leading up to this interview. So I interviewed Chris Cornell in 2007, I believe. It was right after Carry On. It went extremely well. And then I interviewed Chris Cornell again it must have been 2010. It was right after they reunited, but they were starting to kind of work on new material. Actually, was it even? It could have. Well, actually, it was 2011 because I think the song "Live to Rise" was already out. So I'm thinking, oh, the last interview went great. This is going to go great, just like last time. This was for a cover story for Alarm magazine, which is no longer around. Shout out to my longtime editor there, Scott Morrow, who is also a huge fan of the band, and he's the one who assigned me this piece. And from the first question, Chris Cornell is pissed off at me because I quoted the Spin magazine cover story that framed their reunion as something that his ex-wife, their former manager, and his ex-wife, Susan Silver, said in the story that, like, well, Chris wasn't doing too well with the album Scream, and their original intention wasn't to reunite, but they allowed themselves to be convinced, something to that effect. And I was just simply quoting what Spin magazine had said, and as an intro to our conversation, he was pissed right off the jump. And I was like very taken aback by that, because it's it's a really difficult position to be in when you torpedo your own interview from the first word you say. It's really hard to maintain your composure and to keep pressing through, which I did. I felt terrible about it. It soured me on the whole thing for a while. I was like, I didn't want to listen to it. Then I went back and listened to it, and it wasn't quite as bad as I felt in the moment. And it certainly doesn't reflect, I don't even think about that when I listen to their music now. Like, that stuff wears off. I suppose if one of these people did something absolutely horrible and gruesome, it would taint the music forever. But this wasn't enough. I stayed away from the music for a little bit. But so I guess Scott Morrow, the editor at Alarm, thought of the idea of, like, well, let's try to talk to Kim Thayil, or maybe I said that to him. So we then put in the request, and they set me up with Kim Thayil, and we had a fantastic conversation. And as I'm getting off the call, as the call is ending, you can hear Kim Thayil ask their management person who was listening in on the call, is that the same guy that talked to Chris? Because he's puzzled. You can hear it in his voice. He's like, well, I just had a great conversation with this person. And the manager handler guy pauses for a second, and then says, no. And I don't know if he was lying or if he thought it wasn't. I mean, there's no way he wouldn't have known the truth, right? Because we were putting in these requests through management. So that interview went extremely well. We do the cover story, and then around the time of the Down on the Upside vinyl reissue 20th anniversary, this is around 2018. It was like a couple years later than the 20th anniversary. This is following Chris Cornell's death. I interview Kim Thayil for a Billboard piece. And right before that interview, I had interviewed Alex Skolnick from the band Testament about the film Murder in the Front Row. We talked for like 2+ hours. It was an awesome conversation. And I had this thought. I went from that interview right into the interview with Kim, and I had this thought, I hope the recording app I'm using doesn't malfunction, because I had a hint a couple days before of the recording app slightly like canceling out the answers, the audio from someone on the other end. It was a phone app. It was a shitty, stupid, cheap, free phone app, and I don't know why I was using that. But the Alex Skolnick interview went brilliantly. The audio was all there. And I had this thought, because I had been dying to ask Kim or anybody in any of these bands about the thing that I mentioned before. What was the mood like in the band's camp with the fact that you go from 5 million to, we're selling 1 million? Was there an kind of vibe, and how much did that contribute? And of course, I wanted to know, you're putting out the 20th anniversary vinyl of this album. What was going on with this album? And I got to ask him. He answered the question. He even hinted, this is all from memory now, but he hinted that there were elements around Chris suggesting to him that he would be better off on his own, which is a classic thing that happens to bands. I get off the call. All of his audio is wiped. My heart is just like devastated by this. I'm like, fuck. And it's like, there's just enough that you can make out the fact that someone's talking, but you can't make out any words. I found a former, like a retired FBI audio expert, sent them a little bit of this audio. I'm like, can you restore this? And I was like, sorry, we couldn't do anything about it. We could, the mastering engineer, Ruben Cohen, whose work I speak very, very highly of. I had reached out to him about something because I had reviewed an album, Rush Hemispheres remaster that he did. He also remastered And Justice for All by Metallica. I was like, hey, do you think do you think you can help? He's like, I think what happened is there's a noise gate. Something triggered the noise gate on this app and it kicked in and it squashed the audio. It's not salvageable. There's nothing you can do. So I then tell my editor at Billboard, I'm like, I've got nothing. Like, I can't quote this. I can't quote these quotes because there's nothing there. That's the way they used to do it in, newspaper reporters would just write shit down by hand, not even actually quoting somebody verbatim. And so I was like, she's like, okay, she was super cool about it. She was like, all right, well, let's request a follow-up interview and frame it as, well, hey, I didn't get as much as my editor wanted. Can we just follow up on some things and sort of flesh out where we were before? Let's not admit to them basically that the audio was gone. Kim wasn't as open and disclosing in that interview. And in fact, at one point he even says, did your editor put you up to looking for some, juicy details? He was much more defensive. So I'm like, okay. So that was the last time I spoke to him. Those are two separate interviews, but they're basically one's a do-over for the other. So they're grouped together. And then there was these two. And I was happy to, set things right. I remember a friend of mine named Jeff. And I was like, man, I feel so terrible about this. This is like a career low point. This is the worst disaster I've had in an interview. And by the way, I instantly that day, I got better recording gear and I was like, I'm not going to let this happen again. But he was like, who's to say you won't get another chance again? You down the road, it's likely you'll be able to revisit this again. And here we are. I didn't get to revisit it because it just didn't come up. You think, oh my God, you were talking for 2 hours. Could you have asked him about this? Yes, it was on my mind the whole time. But you're also following someone else's lead too as you go along. I definitely wanted to ask, like, hey, now that this book is out, you had mentioned to me before, people, this sort of cliched rock band cliche of like people whispering in your singer's ear that they can go solo. You kind of hinted that was going on. Well, can you follow up? Yes, I wanted to ask, and I didn't. So hopefully I'll get another chance again. Mason says I'm actually kind of I think he means emo, thinking about doing interviews myself, or maybe I don't know what he means by Eno there. Maybe that's a typo, or no, maybe I'm thinking he's referring to Brian Eno, but it's definitely practice, and watching you has given me some inspiration. I guess, dude, that's music to my ears. Of course, I would hope to be an inspiration to people. My approach is pretty choppy, as you can see. Like my delivery is, I'm thinking, my mouth can't keep up with my brain. But I definitely go for something. There's definitely an intention to uncover things that wouldn't otherwise. I don't think I see very much in other interviews. There are people that do get very personal into the human side of things, but there's a certain range of curiosity that I have that I'm looking to satisfy in these interviews, and I love when they go long and people are the interview subject feels stimulated by what I'm putting in front of them. Mason says sometimes the conversation is so good that whatever you're talking about, you don't want to derail the whole thing because you're having a good conversation on one specific thing. That's exactly it. So yes, the entire 2 hours and 15 minutes or whatever that I just showed you, my gears were turning. Like, I want to ask, what about this idea that maybe there was someone pulling on Chris Cornell saying you'd be better off solo? What was the deal? What was their relationship like with their manager at that time, who was his wife? And their marriage, as we came to find out, was also going through turbulence right around that same period. If you read the book, Everybody Loves Our Town, The Oral History of Grunge, that is a fantastic book, and I would not have read it had I not been assigned to do a story in the wake of Chris Cornell taking his own life by Paste Magazine. There was an editor there named Matt Oshinsky, who has moved on to other things, but he pitched to me this idea, like, what was it about the Seattle bands? What was it about the culture of the mentality that they shared, that they were so resistant to fame, that they struggled so much with it, that so many of them ended up dead? Is there some thread running through that community that predisposed them to having problems? It's interesting because Chris Cornell downplayed that whole idea and downplayed that even rock stars have trouble with drugs more than people in other occupations do. It's interesting if you watch other interviews. There's a specific YouTube clip where he's asked about Scott Weiland, and he says, you just see it more in rock musicians than you would with like a plumber or somebody else who has a regular job, and they're struggling with these things too. This is not special to us. But I do think my editor, Matt, was onto something. So I interviewed the director of the film Hype for that piece. And I also interviewed Mark Yarm, no relation to Mark Arm of Mudhoney, who wrote that oral history. And as research, I read that book. It was not going to be a book I was going to read. I'm like, I don't really care to have some writer's take on grunge. I lived through it. I don't really care to have this constantly repackaged and somebody harping on grunge, this many years later. The book is absolutely fantastic. Mark Yarm said that putting together that book drove him into therapy and threatened the foundation of his marriage. I understand why. Because when I'm reading that book, you have like thousands of these quotes, all beautifully arranged into this mega narrative. Just imagine these little teensy fish. Each one is glowing on its own. It's got its own, it's a quote from some person. There's like hundreds of people interviewed from all the bands, all the people you would want to hear from, and then some. Lots and lots and lots of people. Think about sitting down with all these people and having, like, I don't know, X amount of time on some audio device, and then having to go through and hack that, cut that down into something with form. I have no idea how Mark Yarm did it. Apparently he did it with considerable difficulty. Hats off. It is a heroic act of editing and storytelling and writing, really, even though he's dealing with quotes, transcribed quotes, sculpting that into a larger, broader narrative. It's just a beautiful job, and I'm really, really happy I got over my reservation. I was like, well, I'll read this for research, but I wouldn't have read this on my own. I could not recommend that book enough. And it's like, each of those little quotes is a tiny fish, and you've got this whale-sized narrative that you have to turn those into. It's a really brilliant act of collating and writing and editing. Let's see what Mason says here. I was saying, kind of doing interviews myself. I'm sorry, I'm not the best when it comes to messaging these things out. That's okay. The last thing I wanted to share about this is that there's a comparison here. I mentioned before that sometimes I really like the end results when a musician is put in a situation that they are not comfortable with and that they speak about years later as not being the best example of what their work and what they would have wanted to do. You know, some glaring examples come to me. Andy Summers of The Police, one of my all-time favorite bands, one of my all-time favorite musicians. Check out my interview with him, by the way. He said he didn't like the direction on the album Ghost in the Machine, which is one of my favorite albums. It's one of my Desert Island discs. It's one of my top 10 albums. Like, run into the house in a fire, grab this album. He didn't like the keyboards on it. He didn't like the horns. He didn't like it. And he was miserable in the making of it for personal reasons. And he felt it didn't really reflect them. I couldn't disagree more. There's a better parallel example to what Kim Thayil was describing is Jay Bennett from Wilco, the late Jay Bennett. It's not exactly an apples to apples situation, but there are a lot of things that do overlap. So when Wilco were making the album Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, he had a huge production oversight hand in all the experimentation and the overall direction and character of the material on that record. But he wanted to mix it. He envisioned it as a more maximalist, like lots of tracks and something that hewed closer to their roots rock, sort of alt country rock kind of roots. And there are mixes of his that have surfaced. And what Jim O'Rourke did with his mix, because there was friction over this, ultimately led to Jay Bennett quitting or being fired from the band. They brought in Jim O'Rourke, who worked with Sonic Youth. Jim O'Rourke like vaporized a lot of those instruments and turned them into these like starry, staticky, kind of thin, misty atmospheres. And that reminds me of what happened with Kim Thayil with Down on the Upside. You know, it was an application of somebody who had this very particular kind of brilliance, but who saw that like was very entrenched in what they thought the band overall should be. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, let's take not only you, but everything this band is and put it over here in this very different context. And both of these guys dragged their feet. And it's an interesting comparison. Also, another sonic parallel with Down on the Upside is Terror Twilight by Pavement. If you listen to those two albums, that's produced by Nigel Godrich, or who worked with Radiohead. To me, they could almost be cousins, those two albums, in terms of the way they sound, the sonic architecture of those albums. But yeah, I think that covers everything I wanted to say. Do check out the Fuzz Monster YouTube for a bunch of awesome live sets from the 90s. I mean, this stuff is a treasure trove. I found some failure recording, a full set from 1994, which is like the holy grail to me. I did not think that existed on that channel. I have more Soundgarden content in the pipeline. I'm going to be posting all of the aforementioned interviews I mentioned, as well as track by track deep dive on Down on the Upside and my own Soundgarden ranking. So, if you like what I'm laying down and you're into this band and into, bands like this, yes, The viewer, Not Steelopus, said, dude, are you sitting on a treasure trove of these older interviews with musicians? I absolutely am. I have stacks and stacks and stacks. I have gigabytes of this stuff going all the way back to 2003. So, and actually even a little bit further back than that, because I interviewed Henry Rollins after a talking gig he did here in 1997 or 98. I think it was 97. I didn't even go to the talk. I went after it was finished, and I went with a bunch of questions with the tape recorder, and he was cool enough to answer them all. So I'll probably eventually post that at some point. I got so much of this stuff. I need an editor. If you're out there and you want to start editing stuff and sharing in the revenue from the channel, please do reach out. Otherwise, otherwise you can make a donation at the various links I mentioned: Cash App, Venmo, Buy Me a Coffee, etc. Every dollar, every little bit goes a long way, so I can do this long form content, which I love to share with you so much. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Do hit the like, subscribe, notification buttons, and the hype button, all the buttons. But I'm going to be moving along here for FeedbackDef. I am Sabby Reyes Kulkarni, the apostate music journalist. Thanks for hanging with me. Over and out.